Located just south of Starr County is a 170-acre island that Texas law enforcement calls the most dangerous spot in the Rio Grande. It's a place where violence has become the norm, and where those living nearby have been forced to get used to a life in which they have two choices: lead or silver, a bullet or a bribe. Welcome to Fronten Island, though a more accurate name would be Cartel Island. This is the story of how the Mexican cartels took over a U.S. island, turned it into a drug and human trafficking hotspot, and the raid by U.S. law enforcement to finally take it back. So what is Fronten Island anyway? Located in the middle of the Rio Grande, which forms the natural border between Texas and Mexico, between 1852 and 1926, the flow of water slowly cut away at the land to the river's north. That cutting led to the erosion of the land and the creation of a new channel. It also led to the creation of the island in question, dubbed Fronten Island because of its proximity to the Texas village of Fronten. By 1959, the island was a fully formed entity that was acknowledged as Mexican territory, but was placed under the joint control of Mexico and the U.S. arm of the International Boundary and Water Commission, or IBWC. And it's this joint control that would end up paving the way for cartel operations. Squabbles between the IBWC and Mexico started almost immediately, resulting in the IBWC choosing to delineate the international border to America's south, citing the terms of the 1970s Boundary Treaty. In other words, the IBWC attempted to place the island entirely under American jurisdiction, creating a legal gray area. Neither Mexico nor the U.S. would offer up troops or law enforcement officials to patrol the island, and so Fronten Island became a no man's land, though it wouldn't remain one for long. But at least in the early days of this territorial dispute, life on the island was fairly peaceful. The 1980s saw Mexican ranchers using the island to feed their cattle, aided by its lush vegetation and thick bamboo cover. Again, territorial disputes arose. Angered by Mexican ranchers using the island, the Cisneros Ranch of Texas staked its own claim. Again, the island became no man's land, with ranchers from neither side truly using it. And it's around this time that the first criminal activity happened on Fronten Island. On June 10, 1983, a group of 7 armed fugitives escaped from Mexico's Miguel Alemán Municipal Jail. Now serving as an immigration detention center, the jail has a small capacity of just 6 people, and it lies not far from the banks of the Rio Grande. It was larger in the 1980s, though it generally served the same purpose. Still, it wasn't so large that a group of prisoners would have to break through multiple layers of defense. The fugitives would take advantage of this small stature during their escape. Having been sent to work in the prison, the escapees hatched a plan: use their tools to attack a guard before stealing his weapon to aid them in making their escape. Suitably armed, they then escaped from the prison via a gate that had been left open for a lumber delivery and then fled toward Fronten Island, making use of its dense bamboo-laden foliage to hide from the authorities. A potential international crisis was brewing. The escape was worrisome because 3 of the 7 men were being held in connection with the murder of 2 Mexican federal police officials. They were already established as dangerous. Now they were armed. Authorities from Mexico and the U.S. cooperated to arrest the fugitives, though to little avail. Helicopter patrols proved fruitless thanks to Fronten Island's wild and unkempt foliage. The attempted escape was almost successful. Unfortunately for the fugitives, they would eventually have to leave the island. This wouldn't have been a problem if Fronten Island was under the control of the cartels, who would have been able to smuggle them away, but that wasn't the case in 1983. The fugitives were on their own. 3 attempted to leave the island on June 12, 1983, just 2 days after their escape. All were captured. As for the other 4, there is little information about what happened to them and whether or not they were ever captured again. A dangerous precedent had been set, though. The territorial disputes surrounding Fronten Island had resulted in it being poorly guarded and practically unmanned. The perfect place for cartel members to transport drugs, guns, and even people. Enter the Gulf Cartel and the Cartel del Noreste, or CDN, 2 rival gangs who both wish to use Fronten Island as a safe haven and a lookout point. Both are dangerous, murderous gangs that wouldn't blink at the idea of putting a bullet in your head. The Gulf Cartel traces its roots to 1984, which is when Juan Garcia Abrejo took control of what was at the time a relatively small-scale marijuana and heroin smuggling business from his uncle. By the time Garcia was arrested and deported to the United States in 1996, he built a multi-billion-dollar drug empire, with think tank Insight Crime stating that he typically took 50% of the profits from every deal the cartel made. The cartel would only get more dangerous from there. Following Garcia Abrejo's arrest, Osiel Cardenas Guillen took control of the Gulf Cartel. Militarization of the group would follow, with Cardenas recruiting at least 31 former Mexican Special Forces soldiers to serve as enforcers for their gang, as well as train other members. Each of the 31 was tempted by far higher wages than they'd ever seen before, with Guillen offering them 3 times the amount that they'd be earning from the Mexican army. A far more brutal regime was now in place, one that would continue beyond Guillen's 2003 arrest and into the Gulf Cartel's use of Fronten Island. CDN is a newer cartel, though no less dangerous. The group started its life within the Los Zetas cartel, another of Mexico's most dangerous gangs, though it splintered away in 2015 after the capture of the Los Zetas leader, Omar Trevino Morales. That capture led to conflict within Los Zetas, especially when Trevino's brother, Juan Francisco Trevino Morales, tried to ascend to the head of the cartel. Backlash followed. Many Los Zetas members believed the departed Trevino had snitched on other cartel members, and Los Zetas divided into the Zetas Vieja Escuela and CDN factions. CDN took a similarly militant approach to the Gulf Cartel. For instance, the cartel carried out 38 separate armed attacks on Mexican military bases between its 2015 formation and 2022. In addition to an attack on the United States consulate, the message was clear: get in our way and we will fight. It was a message that the group took to Fronten Island and would embody as it battled with the Gulf Cartel for control over the island. Those battles would result in numerous terrifying incidents from 2006 onward. Both identified Fronten Island as prime real estate due to the territorial disputes between the US and Mexico. They saw that neither would send law enforcement or military troops to the island. Each was wary of raising tensions that were already simmering, creating an opening for criminal activity. As Mike Salinas, a Border Patrol agent who spent 30 years in the immediate region, put it, the optics of that whole thing might open up a big old Pandora's box of holy moly. That ambiguity created the perfect drug trafficking corridor. Cartel scouts from both sides could easily monitor the only paved road leading to the island for signs of American police officers patrolling the other side of the border. Incidents would soon follow as the cartels grew even more confident of their immunity. In 2016, cartel gunmen stationed on the island opened fire at DPS officers who were surveilling them from the shore. A gunfight broke out, resulting in one of the DPS soldiers being wounded. Another incident took place in 2019. This time it was a Border Patrol boat sailing through the Rio Grande that became the target of the cartel's ire. As the boat approached Fronten Island, cartel gunmen sprang into action, riddling the vessel with over 50 rounds as it attempted to get away. Amazingly, the attack not only failed to sink the boat, but also failed to harm any of the Border Patrol officers on board. Still, the message was clear: stay away, we control this island. The problem was that this control was split between two cartels, both engaged in human trafficking as well as drug and gun running. That's according to Jason Jones, a former DPS Intelligence Division officer, who said he's heard several stories of the cartel using this island to sneak people into the U.S. The Center for Immigration Studies, or CIS, expands on Jones's claims, noting reports of 8 parents who brought single children over the border via Fronten Island. Each paid $9,000 to the cartel to facilitate their moves from Honduras to the U.S., but the price could vary. The CIS notes that 2 of the parents to whom it spoke said their journeys had cost them $15,000 each. The residents of the Texan village of Fronten didn't have it much better. While the 2 cartels raked in the cash from their drug and human smuggling activities, they also turned their sights toward the 180 residents of the riverfront village that lent their island its name. The village, which is home to primarily ranchers and farmers, was under constant observation. The cartels kept the residents in line with their lead or silver offers, with one 80-year-old resident telling the CIS that he hadn't visited his neighbor's riverfront property in over 30 years, despite it being just 200 yards away, due to his fear. Something had to change. The rise of Governor Abbott signaled a new day for Fronten Island. In 2023, he tasked Texas's state and military forces to not only take Fronten Island by force, but to hold it against the cartel. That task was finally enabled in September 2023 when Buckingham ruled that Texas should control Fronten Island. A raid was being planned, one that would see the island finally fall out of the hands of the cartels that had so brutally controlled it for more than a decade. Dawn broke on October 2, 2023. Abbott stood in front of the assembled forces to deliver words of encouragement. Most were equipped with M4 rifles, shuffling from side to side as Abbott told them that he had prepared medical evacuation plans and that there was extra blood for transfusions available, in case we do get engaged and someone is shot or something. Not exactly a great start to the speech. Still, Abbott also had some words of wisdom for the troops preparing to assault the island. He He told them to watch out for the graffiti-covered structures, many of which were already pockmarked with bullets from cartel activity, because they would give any cartel gunman the height advantage. Those structures were often used by cartel snipers for observation and firing upon Border Patrol personnel, with many having been spray-painted with cartel insignias to show that they belonged to the gangs. The Texas Rangers were also warned about bombs. An improvised explosive had been discovered on Fronten Island just a month before the raid, lying alongside a stash of semi-automatic rifles and ammo. The Rangers were told to be on the lookout for similar stashes, as well as backpacks, piles of clothing, or anything else that seemed suspicious or off on the island. They were told not to touch anything they find, as these types of items are often used by the cartel to lure invaders into booby traps. If they see anything, the Rangers were told, they must mark it, and their commanders will send in one of 3 bomb squads that are on call and ready to follow their leader. The Rangers' captain piped up. He reminded the troops that Fronten Island was subject to a cartel turf war. Bullets may start flying, but it's just as likely that it'll be the Gulf Cartel and CDN fighting amongst themselves, as they'll be firing on the Rangers. When these guys engage, the captain says, we have a lot of bullets fly our way. It's not directed fire, so just be aware of that. He told the Rangers to seek cover and wait for the firing to stop if that happens. But what if it is directed fire? The captain explained that it's a possibility and that the Rangers need to be extra careful in that situation. After all, they're launching the assault alongside the Mexican Federal Police. The Rangers must make every shot count and crucially must avoid hitting any Mexican police officers with their fire. After all, Fronten Island is already subject to territorial tension. A full-blown international incident could occur if the Rangers accidentally fire on anybody who isn't a cartel member. With all of that having been said, the Ranger captain delivered a final piece of advice. Watch out for the killer bees on the island. Fully briefed, the Rangers are prepared to start their assault. Many are restless, talking among themselves or shifting side to side as they await the order to move out. Others may be pondering the reason why they're actually taking this island at all. It's not just that Fronten Island has become a haven of cartel activity, it's also become a key part of Governor Abbott's policy, now that he's in power in Texas. After all, it represents an easy route to America's southern border, which Abbott claims has seen 5 million undocumented immigrants enter the U.S. since President Joe Biden came to power in 2021. Curbing that immigration is the reason that Abbott created Operation Lone Star. The assault will be that operation's crowning achievement if the Texas Rangers manage to pull it off. Still, they'll face challenges. Beyond the incidents already mentioned, the previous few months had seen the island become a hotbed of activity. Earlier in 2023, 5 CDN members were arrested near the island, all equipped with tactical gear and armed with weapons. In August, 1 month before the raid, cameras mounted on the island's trails had captured grainy images of a trio of men believed to be cartel members crossing into Fronten from Mexico via the island. Again, each was wearing body armor and was equipped with a rifle. The Rangers can't afford to take any chances. Still, they have some experience in these island takeovers. In April 2023, DPS agents conducted a similar raid on islands near the city of Eagle Pass. Those islands, which totaled just 45 acres in area, had also been used by cartel members to transport drugs and people. Just like Fronten Island, they were unkempt and covered in vegetation. Only this time, it was carrizo cane plants, which could easily grow as tall as a person, and according to Don Buckingham, grew so thick that it would be impossible to spot a person hiding within them. Even somebody standing 5 feet away would be invisible to infrared cameras, making identification via the naked eye impossible. The Eagle Pass raids had been unqualified successes. Over the course of 2 days following the raids, Border Patrol agents had apprehended 10,000 migrants, as well as seized at least 52 pounds of fentanyl. Buckingham later claimed that it was enough fentanyl to kill every man, woman, and child in the United States, with the haul being accompanied by 38 pounds of ecstasy, 11 pounds of cocaine, and another 11 pounds of methamphetamine. Add 20 firearms, 5 stolen vehicles, and $48,000, and you have the results of a very successful raid. The Texas Rangers are hoping to score a similar result on Fronten Island. With the briefing over, several dozen armed men board a convoy of all-terrain vehicles that set off toward Fronten Island. The men don't embark immediately. Instead, they send out drones, which they use to scan the island's main pathways, as well as the structures they know could house snipers. None are found. The task will be made even more challenging by rare overnight rainfall, which has resulted in the pathways becoming deep and muddy, not ideal for a firefight. The drones return to their vehicles. Already sweating profusely due to the humidity, the Texas Rangers finally head out on foot. They're wearing heavy body armor, as they begin their patrols, with these vanguards being responsible for securing the island for the later arrival of the Texas National Guard engineers. Those engineers will denude the island, cutting away at vegetation and destroying the makeshift structures the cartel has been using. They'll also set up concertina wire before working alongside the Rangers to prevent the island from ever falling into cartel hands again. That will all come in the future. The raid needs to happen first. The Rangers' primary goal is to cut off entry to the island from the south bank of the Rio Grande. Herein lay a potential problem. The Rangers knew that the cartel members had likely already been tipped off to their invasion. They could be running into a firefight as they tried to take the south bank. That isn't what happened. The cartels had indeed been tipped off about the raid, but when they heard about the size and the strength of the force being sent to Fronten Island, they chose to run instead of fight. As the wary Rangers made their way to the south bank target, they encountered nobody. No snipers waiting for them in structures, no explosive devices or cartel members with small arms to fight on the ground. Just an empty island, evacuated by the cartel members who had been using it as a safe haven for years. The raid was a success. The Rangers moved from point to point after securing the south bank access, ensuring that no trace of the cartel remained on the island. Satisfied, they gave the all-clear for the Texas National Guard engineers to follow. Those engineers brought with them more than 1.5 miles of razor wire, which they used to start building fortifications. Foliage was also chopped down, with the goal being to ensure that no cartel members or undocumented immigrants would ever be able to use Fronten Island's dense bamboo to hide from authorities again. This secondary aspect of the taking of Fronten Island would later be called Operation Flat Top. Texas controlled Fronten Island, and not a single drop of blood was shed. Victory was declared on October 3, 2023, marked by the Texas Rangers posing for a photograph with the Texas state flag. The next 2 months or so were taken up by Operation Flat Top, which was completed on November 27, 2023. Fronten Island was finally free of its dense vegetation, as well as being fortified to such the extent that border crossings using the island as an intermediary would become more dangerous than they were worth. The Texas General Land Office triumphantly claimed that there has been a 100% decrease in cartel activity since the completion of the operation. This was all great news for Governor Abbott. Though Abbott wasn't able to declare that same type of haul seen on the Eagle Pass Islands, early warnings to the cartel likely led to a clear-out. He could still claim the taking of Fronten Island as a success for Operation Lone Star. As of December 2023, that operation has seen the apprehension of over 491,100 undocumented immigrants, which includes over 37,800 arrests. Of those arrests, 34,300 have led to felony charges. Operation Lone Star has also taken a big bite out of the fentanyl trade. The Texas government website claims that the operation has seized more than 450 million doses of fentanyl alongside other drugs. Controlling Fronten Island means that Texas has finally cut off a key cartel access point into the U.S., and Abbott doesn't intend to stop there. In February 2024, he announced that work had begun on an 80-acre military base on the banks of the Rio Grande, located 6 miles from Shelby Park. The base will be home to at least 1,800 soldiers, according to Abbott, who will not only enforce his stringent border policies, but also provide support to the Texas National Guard personnel on Fronten Island and in similar locations. That camp will include individual rooms for the soldiers stationed within it, as well as a dining room and built-in Wi-Fi. But there is one final problem to confront: territorial politics. The 1970s boundary treaty mentioned earlier in the video could put some pain to Abbott's efforts to control Fronten Island. That's according to the IWBC, which states that it's in the process of identifying and prohibiting the construction of several structures by Texas. Land bridges, unapproved building work, and the 1.4 miles of razor wire were all falling onto the IWBC's radar as of May 2024, as all can create blockages during flood events. Those blockages could cause a deflection of the Rio Grande's waters toward Mexico, constituting a violation of the 1970 treaty. Dawn Buckingham seems unconcerned. She says that those concerns were merely political. She also claims that Texas is ready to fight any federal officials who attempt to take the island away from the state after Texas Rangers worked so hard to secure it. If they did take that property, she claims, I would invite them to actually secure the border. Abbott faces similar political concerns in the wake of the Rangers' Fronten Island operation. Immediately after he announced his plans for a military base close to Fronten Island, Abbott was mocked by Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. The Mexican president denounced the planned military base as not serious, before adding that it wouldn't do anything to stop undocumented immigration. Abbott disagrees. He believes that this militarization is essential to stopping illegal immigration, noting that actions like installing razor wire had reduced migrant encounters on Texas's border from between 3,000 and 4,000 to just 1% of that number. On the wider level, Abbott's actions have raised tensions between Texas and Mexico, as well as the U.S. federal government. That's according to PRISM Reports, which says that the enacting of Senate Bill 4, or SB 4 by Abbott, has triggered a diplomatic crisis. SB 4 enabled Operation Lone Star by allowing local police to arrest people believed to have crossed the border illegally without seeking prior authorization from their superiors. Though the bill is now tied up in litigation, it seems apparent that Operation Lone Star will only grow bigger if it passes. All of which brings us back to Fronten Island. Right now, it's under Texas control to the point where it's being regularly patrolled by members of the Texas Rangers and the Texas National Guard. However, the territorial disputes that turned it into a no-man's land that enabled cartel usage haven't been resolved. Texas claims ownership, Mexico disputes. And if neither country is careful, we could see another situation in which the island again becomes a safe haven for cartels in the decades to come, as diplomatic infighting undoes the work accomplished since the raid. 50 caliber machine guns on each of the compound's 4 guard towers spit a steady stream of tracer fire into the darkness. The original gunners are all dead, eliminated with chilling precision by unseen snipers in the opening seconds of the assault. Now panic takes hold. Cartel fighters stumble over their fallen comrades, clawing their way to the still smoking machine guns. But it's hopeless. They're hunting ghosts. For the American operators lurking in the shadows, this isn't a capture mission, this is an operation to wipe out senior cartel leadership. Above the relentless thunder of heavy machine guns, a deafening roar cuts through the night. A series of explosions rip through the compound as a pair of 2 Apache gunships rip across the sky, turning their cannons back onto the cartel members in the compound below. This is a glimpse at what an American war against the drug cartels would look like. We'll explain why on today's episode of The Infographic Show, the American military's plan to destroy the cartel terrorists. Using military action against drug cartels is not a new idea. It's been floated by the White House since even before the Reagan years. Both Democrat and Republican administrators have often considered unleashing the might of America's military upon the drug cartels, and yet to date none have. But why? And just how likely is it that the U.S. would go to war with the cartels? A military operation we're calling Tactical Assault on Cartel Organizations, or TACO. For years, the U.S. has flirted with the idea of using military force against Mexican cartels. But recently, the driving force isn't just crime, it's a crisis. Fentanyl, the deadly synthetic opioid, has ignited an epidemic, with overdose deaths skyrocketing since 2014. Back then, the drug was linked to 10,000 deaths. By 2023, that number had exploded to 100,000, with fentanyl responsible for as much as 70% of them. America's chief geopolitical rival might be responsible for this massive uptick in deaths. Up until 2019, China was the world's largest producer of fentanyl, until U.S. diplomatic pressure forced Beijing to officially ban its production. But behind the scenes, China played a different game. While feigning ignorance, China remained the top supplier of fentanyl to drug manufacturers who laced their products with it to maximize addiction. The allegations were never proven, but within the defense community, one theory remains persistent. China knowingly allowed the fentanyl trade to flourish as a form of asymmetric warfare, designed to weaken the United States from within. Unlike Western nations, China doesn't see war as beginning with the first shot fired. Where the West waits for kinetic action, China believes war begins long before, through economic, political, and societal destabilization. This is why China has historically engaged in many gray zone activities against the U.S. and its neighbors in the Pacific. Undermining America with fentanyl was likely one of these activities. For some nationalist Chinese, there was a fitting irony to the situation, as the West had once flooded China with opium in order to disrupt its society and make it easily subjugated politically by Western powers. Despite China banning production of fentanyl in 2019, the nation still remains the largest supplier of fentanyl precursors, with India coming a close second. These two nations together make up the majority of fentanyl supply that manages to make its way inside of the U.S. Short of a full-scale shooting war, the U.S. is limited to diplomatic pressure against both nations, but the cartel are a different matter altogether. The cartels present a clear military target to destroy in hopes of disrupting the drug trade. But before we get to destroying cartels and the consequences, can a president even authorize this kind of military action? American presidents have the authority to deploy military force without congressional approval, but only up to a point. This allows for swift responses to threats without getting bogged down in congressional gridlock. However, a prolonged campaign against the cartels would require full congressional approval. And that's where things get politically dicey. Border states, the ones closest to the fight, may be the least willing to support all-out war. After all, if the U.S. takes the fight to the cartels, those states will be first in the firing line when the cartels strike back. What makes things easier for a president is a clear justification and legislative wiggle room. If a war against the cartels is framed as a retaliation for an attack on Americans, the political path becomes much smoother. One way to do this is by labeling cartels as terrorist organizations. This wouldn't just clear a path for military action, it would transform law enforcement's fight against the cartels. With expanded legal authority and access to greater resources, agencies could strike harder and faster, crippling cartel operations both at home and abroad. As for the possibility of a cartel attack on the U.S., the threat isn't just hypothetical. American counter-narcotics intelligence has long reported that cartels have considered using weaponized drones against U.S. Border Patrol agents. Due to a significantly increased security posture along the border, cartels are finding it more difficult to smuggle drugs and humans into the U.S. Thus, they have floated the idea of using drones to target Border Patrol personnel. If such an attack were to happen, the president would have nearly all the political support necessary to retaliate against cartels. It also would allow them to invoke the United Nations Article 51, which includes provisions for a nation to use military force in self-defense. Mexico remains the wild card in this scenario, but even without Mexico's approval, the U.S. could still take action against the cartel. Title 50 of the U.S. Code of Law allows for a president to order military action against a priority target inside a foreign country, even if that country has not been consulted or coordinated with. The last time Title 50 was invoked, it authorized Operation Neptune Spear, the mission that sent elite U.S. Navy SEALs deep into Pakistani airspace to eliminate Osama bin Laden. Then there's the kinetic option that doesn't place boots on the ground. Instead, it relies on a weapon the U.S. has mastered: drones and airstrikes. America's no stranger to using drone strikes in order to express a difference of opinion with foreign terrorist leaders. In early 2020, a drone strike killed Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leader, Qasem Soleimani, the man responsible for overseeing Iran's vast network of terrorist allies in the Middle East. The problem with this strategy is that while drone strikes are highly effective at eliminating high-value targets with minimal collateral damage, they're unlikely to be enough. Cartels are a persistent and deeply entrenched threat. Even a sustained high-volume drone and airstrike campaign wouldn't be enough to break them. They've already proven their resilience, rapidly replacing key leadership after arrests. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Mexico parade their latest cartel catch as a victory in the war on drugs. Yet the flow of narcotics never stops, not even for a second. Using drones and airstrikes also means the inevitable loss of very valuable intelligence on the ground. In Iraq and Afghanistan, ground raids were preferred when possible, in order to collect critical intelligence, which led to the unraveling of terror groups like Al-Qaeda. Eliminating the cartel would require the same level of engagement. And after 2 decades of fighting an asymmetrical war in the Middle East, there is no nation on earth better prepared for the job than the United States military. That still doesn't mean it would be a cakewalk, as we're about to learn, though. With ground forces as the best option, the first thing that Washington should do is get Mexican approval and a status of forces agreement. These agreements help protect any American soldiers accidentally left behind or captured from prosecution by a host nation. It would also pave the way for better cooperation on the ground. At the moment, Mexico seems unlikely to grant this permission, as Mexico's president has seen the White House's call for military action against the cartels as a violation of its sovereignty. But in the future, an agreement may be reached, and until then, there's another weapon that can be deployed against the cartels: the 7th Special Forces Group. Stationed in Florida, the 7th SFG operates in 32 countries across Central and South America. Its soldiers are not only highly trained, but also fluent in local languages and deeply familiar with regional customs. For decades, the 7th SFG has been the go-to force for U.S. counter-narcotics operations throughout the region. The 7th SFG has embedded itself with host nation militaries to help train them and form elite counter-narco units. Rather than go out into the field and pull the trigger themselves, they teach their hosts how to do it instead. The U.S. could deploy the 7th to Mexico and ramp up military support in the form of ammunition and equipment, letting Mexican military forces take the lead. The U.S. could also provide air support and intelligence gathering assistance to the Mexican military. This is likely the way Mexico would prefer it, as it would not be seen as a violation of its sovereign territory by locals. But if the White House was insistent on taking action itself, There's various tools it would use, and we're already seeing some of them move into position. First, any military action against the cartels would require a massive strengthening of the border security beforehand. Under fire, the cartels would retaliate, and without a fortified border, that violence wouldn't stay confined to the south. There are already over 500 Marine engineers on the border to repair and strengthen infrastructure and barricades. In the wake of a full-blown war against the cartels, we would expect to see many more similar engineering units begin construction on fortifications and barricades. National Guard forces would also be deployed to reinforce Border Patrol agents along the nearly 2,000-mile border. Their presence wouldn't just add manpower, it would bring critical air surveillance assets, allowing for real-time monitoring and a rapid response to any cartel retaliation attempts. Next, the U.S. would need to establish a massive logistical presence along the border to sustain long-term operations. With numerous military bases spread across the southern U.S., American forces would have deep operational reach into Mexico. Combat and surveillance aircraft could maintain extended loiter times, providing persistent coverage over the northern half of the country. However, resupply of forces deployed into Mexico itself would require pre-staging of everything from medicine to ammunition and food. This is where cooperation agreements with Mexico would be critical. Without secure land routes into Mexico, the U.S. could be forced to rely solely on air operations for resupply, which would be a risky gamble. Cartels have grown increasingly sophisticated, and their expanding arsenal could pose a serious threat to transport aircraft operating in contested airspace. Long before the hostilities begin, though, U.S. surveillance assets would begin sniffing out intelligence on the cartels, especially to build out patterns of life, which are crucial in targeting. This intelligence can include intercepted phone calls, physical tracking of cartel and cartel forces' movements, and human intelligence on the ground in the form of cooperative locals. Here, we are actually seeing the U.S. already laying the groundwork. For what might be the first time in history, 2 American Rivet Joint intelligence gathering aircraft were recorded flying in the Gulf of California in early February 2025. This area of Mexico is controlled by the Sinaloa Cartel, and the Rivet Joint aircraft would be powerful tools in gathering local intelligence. These aircraft are amongst the deadliest in the U.S. arsenal, not because of the weapons they pack, but because of their ability to vacuum up huge amounts of intelligence. Each aircraft comes packed with all manner of highly classified signals intelligence systems that can detect, intercept, and if necessary, decode electronic signals. They can also work backward from the signal's receipt, pinpointing the exact location of the transmitting device. From there, they can track its movement in real time, following the operator as they travel throughout the country. They can also use synthetic aperture radar to track movements of distant forces, and it can do all of this up to a range of hundreds of miles. The presence of 2 Rivet Joint aircraft is the strongest indicator yet that the White House is serious about using military force against the cartels. The vast amount of intelligence these aircraft pick up will be used to track cartel operations, even down to individual leaders. With the ability to instantly relay data to American intelligence forces worldwide, each Rivet Joint becomes a gateway into the inner workings of the Sinaloa Cartel. It allows thousands of U.S. and allied intelligence operatives to analyze and map the cartel's networks, uncovering the best ways to dismantle its operations. In addition to pre-staging equipment and deploying Tier 1 special forces to lead the fight, the U.S. would also need to position conventional forces near the border. These units would be essential for launching cross-border raids and providing rapid support to ongoing operations, ensuring sustained pressure on the cartels. Again, the U.S. is already taking steps with the deployment of members of the 82nd Airborne to the southern border. Deploying combat troops in this manner sends a powerful message to both Mexico and the cartels that the White House is serious. The 82nd Airborne Division, one of the U.S. military's premier rapid response forces, would make that message unmistakable. Conventional forces would play a key role in a conflict that would be centered mostly around the use of special forces. Anytime that special forces end up biting off more than they can chew, they call for help from local conventional forces, which are usually responsible for establishing a rapid reaction force. Units like the 82nd could provide support for special operations forces via air or land insertion, rapidly deploying via helicopters or armored vehicles. Again, this is where having Mexican cooperation would be critical, as it would allow these forces to be stationed inside Mexico itself and closer to the fighting. They would also be responsible for conducting deterrence patrols in local areas in order to keep cartels from launching retaliation raids against civilians. But we'll dive into cartel tactics in just a minute. Any further deployments would depend on the nature of expected fighting. The cartels are heavily armed, but not so heavily armed as to pose a significant threat, requiring the use of things such as armored forces. The heaviest piece of equipment that cartels have been seen operating are homemade narco tanks. These are usually makeshift armored vehicles that use a truck chassis and steel plates for protection. These tanks may have smaller caliber weapons, such as machine guns, and occasionally even a small caliber cannon. But against U.S. forces armed with advanced anti-vehicle drones, the threat would be minimal. Switchblade 600s could strike with precision, while loitering air cover from Apache helicopters and AC-130 gunships to Reaper and Predator drones armed with Hellfire missiles would ensure battlefield dominance. And if brute force was needed, the vaunted A-10 Warthog would be more than up to the task. And that's right, there's already talk about how a narco war could revive the Warthog, which would soon become the premier close air support weapon for American forces. With its extremely tough and durable airframe, it's the perfect weapon for flying low and slow against cartel forces that are increasingly armed with sophisticated equipment of their own. The A-10 may have been born to hunt Soviet tanks, but it has excelled in the close air support role for troops fighting insurgents and terrorists. Other cheaper aircraft like the Super Tucano would also play a key role, though currently they're only being used for training. The need for cheap and persistent air support could see the U.S. buying many more of these agile aircraft. Armed with overwhelming firepower and the best surveillance and recon capabilities in the world, America's forces would make short work of the cartels inside of Mexico. Much has been made about the fearsome reputation of the cartels, but they remain largely thugs with guns. Meanwhile, the U.S. military has spent 20 years and billions of dollars honing itself to fight exactly this type of asymmetrical war. That doesn't mean that the cartels would be a pushover. There's a very good reason why previous administrations have never used military force against the cartels. While America is, in fact, at the height of its skills in waging asymmetrical warfare, the cartels pose a significant threat due to their proximity to the U.S. When fighting terrorists and insurgents, the U.S. had the security of thousands of miles of separation between them and the American homeland. In this case, only a single border separates the fighting. Mexico's cartels have proven time and again to be resourceful and innovative organizations, quickly adapting new capabilities and regularly outfoxing both Mexican and American law enforcement. After 50 years of the war on drugs, we'd like to remind the audience that drugs remain absolutely undefeated. And that's not just due to the insatiable demand from Americans seeking any escape from the capitalist hellscape they find themselves in. It's because of the cartel's ability to adapt. The cartels would lose any stand-up fight against U.S. forces. A smart cartel leader would be willingly sacrificing underlings in positions of power to give U.S. forces a sense of accomplishment while going underground. Cartel compounds may be famously extremely well guarded, but a single volley of Tomahawk missiles would flatten any piece of architecture the U.S. military does not want standing. The level of firepower the American military brings to this fight is simply unsurpassed, which is why cartel forces would inevitably turn to asymmetric warfare. And with the U.S. border so close, one highly vulnerable target could hand them a victory, even against the full might of the American military. At the moment, there is an estimated 100,000 or so cartel members inside of the United States, overseeing operations on this side of the border. If cartels have no hope of beating the U.S. military, then their best strategy is to instead beat the American people. Cartel forces would likely launch a massive wave of terrorism across the United States. While there would be no flashy attacks such as the September 11th attacks, cartel violence inside of America could be even more devastating than the 9/11 attacks were. For starters, cartel gunmen would go after the families of U.S. service members. Most military families live in on-base housing, where security is handled by military police. But while MPs provide protection, they are neither trained nor equipped to repel a full-scale assault like conventional infantry forces. But targeting of family members would likely take place off-base, and cartels have shown great sophistication in their ability to gather open-source intelligence. Finding out who is a military spouse or a relative of a service member would not be particularly difficult in the age of social media. Cartels would also target regular civilians, carrying out retaliatory attacks on places such as shopping centers, concerts, and other areas where large numbers of people usually gather. Next, the cartels would target American infrastructure. The organizations the U.S. would be fighting are not just well-funded, they are wealthy enough to hire the same former Special Forces operatives the U.S. relies on to hunt them. And that exposes a dirty secret the American Special Forces community doesn't like to talk about. A growing number of retirees are offering their skills to the highest bidder, including Mexican cartels, which pay a premium for their expertise. A campaign of industrial and commercial sabotage would be aimed at disrupting the daily life of millions of Americans. For example, cartel saboteurs could target your local power plant, destroying or disabling one or more of its generators. The resulting blackouts could last for days or even as much as weeks and bring about absolute chaos. We only have to look at the New York City blackouts or the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina to see just how fast civilized people become uncivilized in the absence of electricity and running water. America is completely vulnerable to these attacks, now more than ever with the rise of drone warfare. Historically, any nation or terrorist group that has attempted to wage war against the U.S. has faced a massive hurdle. They've had to transport men and equipment across thousands of miles of ocean to reach American soil. The cartels, however, are different. They would be the first enemy America has faced on its own doorstep since the Confederacy had to be reminded that owning people is both evil and uncivilized. And this is the secret of the cartels, and why, despite America's overwhelming superiority, no administration before has ever authorized military action against them. The Los Zetas cartel members duck for cover behind their truck as bullets ricochet off the metal. They peer over the hood, searching for the source of the gunfire that's already taken out several of their men. Then another eruption. From the ranch house ahead, a relentless barrage blasts from every door and window. The cartel men fire back. They shout. They try to negotiate. Even grenades don't break the onslaught. Who are they up against? Who did they mess with? Cartels are feared for their brutality, their violence, and their ability to terrorize entire regions. They seem unstoppable, but sometimes they pick the wrong fight. And when they do, they are the ones who pay the price. Today on the Infographic Show, we're going to look at the times cartels messed with the wrong people. In 2010, 77-year-old rancher, businessman, and seasoned hunter Alejo Garza Tamez purchased almost 5,000 acres of land, San Jose Ranch near Ciudad Victoria, Tamaulipas. Tamez had been a hard worker and an outdoorsman his entire life, and he had a great reputation among his community for honesty and integrity. He looked forward to spending his twilight years working his new ranch just one state over from his childhood home in Nuevo León. But there was just one problem. Large parts of Tamaulipas were under the control of the Los Zetas cartel, one of the most brutal and feared cartels in all of Mexico. By the time Tamez purchased his ranch, they were more powerful than ever, having just overtaken their equally terrifying rival, the Sinaloa cartel, in terms of land acquired, and they wanted more. So on November 13, 2010, members of Los Zetas approached Don Alejo with some guns and a proposition. Leave your property within the next 24 hours or you will die. But Don Alejo was not one to back down easily. He looked up at the cartel members and calmly responded, "I'll be waiting for you." Tamez knew what was coming, and he wasn't about to go down without a fight. To protect those around him, he sent his workers away, ensuring that they wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. But he wouldn't be alone, and he definitely wouldn't be powerless. What Los Zetas didn't realize was that Tamez had a secret weapon, actually several secret weapons. A lifelong hunter, he had an arsenal of high-powered rifles. He spent the evening loading every single one, positioning them at windows and doors. He reinforced his cover, securing every firing position for maximum protection. His ranch had just become a fortress, like a much more serious, deadly version of Home Alone. The cartel, true to their word, arrived the next day ready to kill Don Alejo. Los Zetas had such a fearsome reputation that they drove into the ranch firing shots into the air and announcing their arrival, expecting the old rancher to flee. Don Alejo did not run. He fired back. The cartel members ran for cover, realizing Tamez would not go quietly. Unfortunately, Los Zetas had also come prepared with not only guns but grenades. But the rancher was hardier than he seemed. He fired on the cartel for hours, defending his home and making it impossible for them to take the ranch. By placing guns at multiple doors and windows, Tamez also threw the cartel into confusion. He would run between the guns and fire them to give the impression that he had his own band of vigilantes with him, confusing the cartel as to where and how to aim at Tamez himself. What should have been a quick and brutal cartel takeover turned into an hours-long firefight. The relentless gunfire eventually drew the attention of the Mexican Marines, who moved toward the scene. When Los Zetas realized reinforcements were coming, they retreated. They left 6 of their own behind, either dead or too wounded to escape. By the time the Marines arrived, over 1,000 shell casings littered the ground outside Don Alejo's home. They found 4 cartel members dead, 2 more severely injured. But inside, they also found Don Alejo himself. He had held his ground, but not without a cost. 2 bullet wounds and shrapnel from a grenade blast had ended his fight. Yet in death, he had accomplished what few ever had. He didn't just resist the cartel, he made them retreat. His last stand took down 6 of Los Zetas' men and turned him into a legend. At first, many media outlets refused to report on what had happened, either because they were controlled by Los Zetas or they didn't want grenades thrown at them. The Milenio newspaper picked up the story. It spread like wildfire through Mexican social media, making Tamez look like a folk hero. Another Mexican citizen decided to take the fight against the cartel one step further. He wouldn't just defend himself, he would raise a whole army. This is the story of Hipólito Mora Chavez, the man who could not be corrupted, according to fellow vigilante Reverend Gregorio Lopez. In early 2013, the Knights Templar cartel ruled Michoacan, an area ominously nicknamed La Tierra Caliente, or the Hot Land. Their grip was absolute, their brutality was unchecked. Many local farmers and residents had already fled, abandoning their land in search of safety. Those who stayed lived under constant fear, forced to either submit to cartel demands or risk deadly consequences. Hipólito Mora, a Michoacan native, was angered by the people who had overrun his home. They would kidnap young women and girls for months at a time, hassle, assault, and extort or murder local lime pickers. Much of the economy relied on lime, and they generally brutalized the population. Mora said there were times that we wouldn't be allowed to work. Nobody dared say anything because they were murderers. They'd killed a lot of people, and they threatened employers. Initially, he tried to get his political leaders to pay more attention to what was happening in his state. However, as you'll see later on in an even crazier example, the state has rarely helped, and sometimes even hindered locals going up against the cartels. Mora even went to Mexico City to try to meet with the president, but nobody met with him. Running out of options, Mora returned to Michoacan with a plan: form a vigilante group. He gathered up a group of friends and asked, "What are we going to do? Are we going to wait for them to kill us? To die of hunger? We have to fight." Most people in his hometown of La Ruana were too terrified to stand with him, but eventually 5 trusted friends agreed it was time to fight back. One member of the vigilante group went around town calling for an emergency meeting to discuss the dire security situation. When the townspeople gathered in the square, many wore masks, still fearful of the Knights Templar's wrath. But as Mora rallied them, his words ignited something deeper than fear. He called on them to defend their community, to take back what was theirs. And in that moment, 250 people stepped forward ready to fight. They rushed home to grab whatever weapons they could. A handful of people had AR-15s and AK-47s, but most showed up with shotguns, bird hunting rifles, and anything else that they could muster. The motley crew would then become the first official self-defense movement in Mexico, the Autodefensas. The now armed locals got on motorcycles and bicycles and rode up to homes and ranches that had been overtaken by the Knights Templar. But when they got there, the residences were empty. It turns out some of the girlfriends of the Knights Templar had attended the meeting, and they tipped off the cartel members about the townspeople's wrath, not to mention the incoming armed invasion. The Autodefensas retook their old homes without a single bullet being fired. Not only that, but the Knights Templar had left behind some snazzy new transportation for them, Mercedes and BMWs that they abandoned in a hurry, a big upgrade from their bicycles that they'd rode in on. And to the surprise of almost everyone, the movement worked, mostly because it also inspired neighboring movements to start. Once people saw the Knights Templar could be scared away by the threat of popular uprising alone. In the neighboring town of Tipalcatepec, another man named José Manuel Mireles Valverde, nicknamed the Doctor because, well, he was a doctor, started his own Autodefensa group. The vigilantes barricaded the town's entrances, daring the Knights Templar to try crossing them again. And they did. Gunfire erupted as raids spread across the towns. The cartel, desperate to reclaim their lost strongholds, launched a counteroffensive. When the direct attacks failed, they turned to a new tactic: siege warfare. The Templarios set up blockades around the towns controlled by the Autodefensa groups, choking off vital supplies. Food, gasoline, and medicine ran dangerously low, pushing communities to the brink. Then in April 2013, the cartel struck back with brutal force. During a protest, the Knights Templar's gunmen unleashed a massacre, killing 12 people, most of them innocent lime workers caught in the crossfire. But once the locals saw that drug cartels could be beaten, nothing would stop them. Even the residents of Michoacan that had fled to the United States came back to the region to help their fellow community members. Out of 113 municipalities in Michoacan, 42 ended up with Autodefensa groups. Within a time span of 10 months, the Knights Templar's power was completely broken. People who had left the town years ago trickled back in. Farmers recovered the land that had been stolen from them by the cartels. Crime went down. A certain peace returned to the streets again. All because of the initial bravery of Hipólito Mora. Unfortunately, Mora suffered personal losses as his son was killed in the winter of 2014 while working with the Autodefensas. This triggered a deep rage in Mora, who pledged to go after the man responsible. Knowing this made him an even bigger target for the cartel. He moved many of his family members out of the country to get them out of the cartel's reach while he waited for a final showdown. The story doesn't have a great end, because a new violent narcos group called the DEADLIEST Cartel rose up to take the place of the Knights Templar in the area. The autodefenses group got infiltrated by the cartels themselves, and in 2023, Hipólito Mora was killed by cartel members. Mora was moved by a sense of injustice, a sense that he and others like him had been abandoned by their government to the mercy of the cartels. He is remembered as a hero. For others, their vengeance against the cartels were more personal. Miriam Rodriguez had a pretty normal life in an area of Mexico called San Fernando. Married with 3 kids, she owned a cowboy apparel store called Rodeo Boots. Her 20-year-old daughter, Karen, helped her run it. Unfortunately, the Zetas cartel was very active in San Fernando, so much so that Miriam's son had moved away from the area to escape the danger of being forced into cartel work or becoming a victim of violence. On January 23, 2014, Karen was driving on one of the roads in town when 2 trucks boxed her in and forced her to stop. Men with guns sprang out of the trucks, smashed their way into her pickup truck, and kidnapped her. They took her back home, where unfortunately her mother was gone, as she worked as a nanny in Texas occasionally. Rodriguez found out about her daughter's kidnapping and rushed back home in despair. Eventually, the family would receive a letter with very specific instructions. If they left a payment and they did everything the cartel told them to, they would get their daughter back. The Rodriguez family didn't have a lot of money, so they took out a loan from the bank. Miriam's husband left a bag filled with cash near the local health clinic. The letter told him to wait at the local cemetery for Karen's return. He waited and waited, but no one showed up. Her parents could not accept that. Miriam would find another way to get her daughter back. Desperate to see her child, she asked for a meeting with the Zetas cartel, who, perhaps surprised by the request, agreed. So Miriam went to a local restaurant called El Junior. A young man walked in and sat down opposite her. The young cartel member pretended he knew nothing about Miriam's daughter and said the cartel didn't have her. Why would drug dealers lie, after all? But he might be able to help her find her if Miriam would give him $2,000. Hoping to find her daughter, Miriam got the money together and handed it over. But after a while, the young man stopped answering his phone. She got calls from others claiming to be working with the kidnappers, needing a little more money before releasing Karen. Miriam paid out a few more times, but eventually she realized there was no hope for her daughter. In fact, she came to the conclusion that Karen was probably not even alive. With this realization, Miriam changed. Her pain turned into anger. She resolved to go after the people who had taken her young daughter. But she only had one piece of evidence to go on. While Miriam had been at the restaurant with the first cartel member, he had a walkie-talkie on him. Through the static, she heard someone call him by name once, Sama. With just one first name, she would start following a trail that would lead her to bring down 10 cartel members. Because Miriam wanted answers, but more than that, she wanted revenge. So she started an investigation, going through social media accounts to find the person she had met with, and then track down his acquaintances. She found that one of his close friends ran an ice cream shop and decided to stake it out. Eventually, she saw Sama and followed him home. Miriam also changed her appearance so she wouldn't be recognized, cutting her hair short and dyeing it a bright red. She turned to the authorities, but unsurprisingly, they offered little help. Refusing to give up, she finally found a federal official willing to take action. That official tracked down Sama, who quickly cracked under interrogation. He gave up the names of the other cartel members, including those responsible for Karen's murder, and even revealed the location where she had been killed. Some of Karen's remains were later discovered inside a cartel safe house, a grim confirmation of her fate. But this wasn't the end of the road for Miriam. She would find every single cartel member responsible for her daughter's death, despite the danger to her life. "I don't care if they kill me. I died the day they killed my daughter." Perhaps her most famous cartel member capture happened near the US-Mexico border. Many of the cartel members who had kidnapped her daughter had tried to restart their lives with new identities, including one man who ended up selling flowers near the border. Miriam knew this because she had done a year's worth of legwork to get at him, essentially becoming his super stalker. She scoured his online presence, interviewed former criminal associates, and donned disguises to trick his relatives into revealing details about him. When she found him, she set off toward the bridge where he worked with a trench coat, a baseball cap, and a gun in her purse. However, the former cartel member knew Miriam was coming, and when he saw her and recognized her, he sprinted away. At 56 years old, Miriam Rodriguez wasn't about to let him escape again. She took off in pursuit on foot, closing the distance with relentless determination. She grabbed him and threw him onto the rails of the bridge. Then, to make sure he stayed put, she pulled out her gun and leveled it at him and snarled, "If you move, I'll shoot you." She called the police, who came an hour later to arrest him. Other cartel members under assumed identities were also brought down and put into prison by Miriam. They had disguised themselves as car salesmen, cab drivers, babysitters, anything but cartel members. Miriam had her own tricks up her sleeve, though. Rodriguez became a master of deception, constantly changing her hair and appearance to avoid detection. She posed as pollsters, health workers, even local officials, anything to get the information she needed. But her relentless pursuit of justice made her a marked woman. On Mexico's Mother's Day, tragedy struck. As she hobbled toward her home on crutches, still recovering from a broken foot, cartel gunmen recently released from prison were waiting. They opened fire, killing her just steps from her front door. So far, the people the cartels have messed with got back at them in inspiring ways, but many of them also met awful ends. However, there are some new autodefensive groups in town that are still going, and they're coming from some unexpected and historically sidelined groups in Mexican society: women and indigenous people. First up is El Machete. Indigenous people in Mexico have been discriminated against compared to the white and mestizo population. They also fall victim to cartel violence at higher rates because they're more likely to live and work in rural areas that the cartels control and run operations in, and society as a whole advocates for them less than others. In the town of Pantelo in Chiapas, the conflict between the local cartel, Los Herrera, and the indigenous groups would come to a head in 2021. Local people disliked Los Herrera because they suspected them correctly of infiltrating the local government. Los Herrera disliked the accusations. So one day the gang murdered an indigenous man in his own field. They hoped that this violence would intimidate and silence their detractors. In fact, the opposite would happen because, as it turns out, Los Herrera had underestimated their opponents and clearly messed with the wrong villagers. Locals armed themselves and confronted Los Herrera, which ended in a shootout that killed 2 gang members. Emboldened by this small victory, a local man made a video in the majority indigenous language, Tzotzil, that was posted and reposted everywhere. The video makes it clear that the local community will take care of itself, with armed members working in defense of the people of Pantelo against the narcos. The new group would call itself El Machete. "Long live El Machete" and "Narcos out" were painted on buildings around town. The ranks of the group and their collaborators swelled to a couple of thousands, armed with whatever they could find. By June of that year, tensions erupted into an all-out war between El Machete and Los Herrera, turning the town into a battleground. Shootouts broke out across the streets, forcing thousands of residents to flee, hoping that they could one day return to a safer home. In response, the Mexican military and police moved in to restore order, but the chaos didn't spare them either. Some officers were caught in the crossfire and wounded by El Machete's own gunfire. This only deepened the government's disapproval of the vigilante group, raising questions about whether they were protectors or just another armed faction fueling the violence. El Machete retreated, clarifying that they had not meant to hurt innocent people. Slowly, people started trickling back into the town. El Machete organized a little victory lap for their members, with around 15% of the town, or 3,000 people, cheering them on. As the townspeople came back in, people started to suspect that the gang members were hiding among them and coming in to reclaim their old properties. Knowing that the state security forces wouldn't be in town forever, and realizing that they couldn't let all their efforts go to waste, El Machete swore that they would never let Los Herrera regain a foothold in their town. So on July 26, they launched a massive blitzkrieg-style raid to obliterate any traces of Los Herrera that they could find. El Machete members tore through any and every Los Herrera property, ransacking and destroying anything that belonged to the criminal organization. One man said, "We left the homes of the narcos and assassins the same way they left our family members when they killed them or stole their land." Though some, including former Mexican President Obrador, criticized El Machete and its methods, many locals saw no alternative for their protection. The members of El Machete stressed that their vigilantism was only in response to the constant violence they faced at the hands of the cartels. Once Pantelo is free of organized crime, once it's free of assassins and drug traffickers, we as the defenders of the people will retire because we are not looking for power or money. There have been few updates about activities in the area since, which hopefully means things have quieted down. Perhaps another vigilante group, this time in El Terrero, Michoacán, and yes, you probably noticed the state has more than its share of cartel problems, will succeed in kicking the cartel out of their hometown. But this group is different. Almost all of its members are women. Part of the problem with cartel violence is that it decimates the male population of a community. Men are killed, kidnapped to be forced into cartel life, or end up joining the cartels out of desperation and a lack of any other profitable work to do in the area thanks to the cartel's meddling. Michoacán, part of La Tierra Caliente, as we mentioned before, isn't just known for cartel violence, it's also the world's largest exporter of avocados and limes. But the cartels have embedded themselves deep into the region's agricultural industry, siphoning profits from local farmers and lime pickers. For many, growing and selling these crops should be a path to prosperity. Instead, it's another industry under cartel control, where hard-earned income is stolen at gunpoint. The Jalisco Cartel is the biggest threat in El Terrero and has caused a lot of suffering and damage. The 29-year-old son of Eufrosina Blanco Nava, one of the female vigilantes, was abducted by the Jalisco Cartel. To this day, she doesn't know if he's been killed or forced to work for them. One woman who joined the vigilante group did so after her 14-year-old daughter was kidnapped. The Jalisco Cartel may have thought that kidnapping a child would inspire fear in her mother and the other family members, but instead, it made her mom angry and determined to make her town safe. The women said, "We are going to defend those we have left, the children we have left, with our lives. We women are tired of seeing our children, our families disappear. They take our sons, they take our daughters, our relatives, our husbands. Nothing will stop them from pursuing justice, not even pregnancy or having to carry toddlers on their back while they patrol their community with rifles." Reporters who have spoken with locals estimate that the vigilante group consists of around 50 women. Determined to turn their town into a stronghold, they've dug trenches, demolished roads, and blocked key routes leading from Jalisco, the cartel's stronghold, making it nearly impossible for enemies to roll in. They've even built a homemade tank, welding steel plates onto a heavy-duty pickup truck, turning it into a mobile fortress. Any dirt roads still passable are regularly patrolled by armed women, ready to defend their town at any cost. Most of them have already lost loved ones to the cartel, and they refuse to lose anything more. Glass flasks bubble and hiss in the corner of a makeshift cartel lab, hidden deep inside the Sinaloan scrubland. The air is thick with chemical fumes, and masked men, faces obscured by bandanas, move with precision, loading bags of light blue fentanyl pills into a container, bound for the U.S. border. Suddenly, the door blasts open. Masked Special Forces operatives storm in, silent, ruthless, and unstoppable. AR-15s up, fingers on the trigger. No warnings, no arrests, no survivors. Make no mistake, the CIA has just declared war on the narco-terrorists. Find out more on today's episode of The Infographic Show, inside the CIA's new secret plan to sniff out Mexican cartels. Drug use, crime, and overdose deaths in the U.S. are spiraling out of control. In 1980, around 2,500 Americans died from overdoses each year. By the early 2000s, that number had risen to 20,000. And with the opioid crisis, it skyrocketed to over 110,000 per year in the 2020s. In 2022 alone, over 112,500 people died from opioids, surpassing 42,500 fatal car crashes and 24,900 homicides. In just 5 years, drug deaths have exceeded U.S. combat deaths in both World War I and World War II, and more than twice as many Americans died from drugs in a single year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. These deaths of despair, hitting mostly low-income men but also many women, have become a national emergency. The traffickers behind the crisis no longer rely on poor opium farmers in Mexico, Afghanistan, or Southeast Asia. Instead, they're using precursor chemicals to manufacture a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. A small kitchen lab can now produce enough fentanyl to kill millions, and these labs are everywhere in Mexico. Colima, a city in western Mexico, has become the murder capital of the world, and the driving force behind the bloodshed is fentanyl precursor chemicals, the key ingredients needed to manufacture the deadly synthetic opioid. These chemicals flood into the port of Manzanillo, sparking brutal cartel wars over the control of the supply. In 2023, Colima reported 140 murders per 100,000 people, a staggering figure, yet still an improvement from 182 per 100,000 in 2022. As long as the fentanyl trade flourishes, so will the violence it breeds. Across Mexico, over 42,000 people were murdered in 2023 alone. This isn't just cartel violence, it's an all-out war, fought in the streets and fueled by drugs, money, and power. Despite decades of crackdowns, the problem has only escalated. In 2022, authorities seized more than 10,000 pounds of fentanyl powder. In 2023, over 12,000 pounds was seized. In 2024, it was back down to a semi-respectable 6,100 pounds. Fentanyl is cheap to produce, it requires minimal labor, and it doesn't rely on distant poppy fields, making it the perfect product for the cartels. And the numbers prove it. By 2018, heroin made up 80% of all opioid seizures at the U.S.-Mexico border. By 2022, that number had plummeted to just 7%, a clear sign that fentanyl had taken over. But authorities estimate that only 5 to 10% of drugs are intercepted before reaching the US streets, leaving millions of lethal doses in circulation. This is where the CIA comes in. Stopping drugs at the border is nearly impossible. By the time fentanyl's on the way, it's already too late. The only real way to fight back is by hitting it at the source. The US tried a similar strategy with cocaine, pressuring Latin American countries to destroy coca fields. And that plan backfired. The coca leaves themselves cost the cartels almost nothing, and the crackdown only led to poor farmers being arrested while new ones took their place elsewhere. But fentanyl is different. Maybe. Fentanyl is made in labs. Sometimes those are in the forest, but often they're in houses in cities where the drugs are cooked on stoves in regular kitchens where pans boil with what looks like a white creamy liquid. And it's often ordinary people, not hardcore lifetime gangsters. After Mexico was threatened with tariffs over the fentanyl problem, the authorities suddenly got very good at busting these labs and kitchens, taking a record haul at the end of 2024. Hidden in a truck in Sinaloa, they found 1,700 pounds and another 660 pounds in a house nearby, plus a huge stash of precursor chemicals. In a separate bust, they got 4 pounds of pills, 20 million doses worth, nearly $400 million on the street. Crackdowns tend to backfire, pushing the remaining criminals to take desperate measures, which so far has meant a whole lot of murder. But what it hasn't done is stop people from cooking fentanyl, and for good reason. Fentanyl chefs have openly admitted that their work has given them sports cars, houses, and ranches. One crew even bought a helicopter and a small plane. "This is what makes us rich," one of them said bluntly. "Drug trafficking is the main economy here." Many of these kitchen labs in Mexican cities are being shut down by law enforcement, forcing cartels to move operations to more remote locations. That's why the CIA has deployed MQ-9 Reaper drones, the same high-tech machines that have wiped out terrorist cells across Asia. Flying at altitudes of 50,000 feet, these drones can pinpoint targets with deadly precision. But in Mexico, they're for surveillance, tracking cartel movements and feeding intel to Mexican authorities. But how long before that changes? This could be one way forward, a crackdown that finally cripples the cartels. But here is the problem. In 2021 alone, 2.5 million Americans aged 18 or older had an opioid use disorder, a crisis fueled in part by unscrupulous pharmaceutical companies. When the government cracked down on Big Pharma for overprescribing high-powered opioids, addicts didn't just quit, they turned to the streets. First for heroin, then for synthetics like fentanyl. The US now consumes over 80% of the world's opioids, and when the demand is this high, suppliers don't back down. Mexico's drug trade rakes in tens of billions every year, and the cartels won't give up without a fight. And then there's China. For years, sketchy Chinese chemists have been manufacturing fentanyl precursors and shipping them directly to the cartels. When the US confronted China's foreign ministry, the response was blunt: China has strictly regulated these chemicals, and if America wants to point fingers, it should start looking inward. Recently, China's been working more closely with the US to address the opioid crisis, but the precursors are still flowing. So, on top of the surveillance drones, the CIA is now using its long reach of intelligence working with China to bust the supply chains. This has led to some of the Chinese precursor producers moving operations to India. Understanding these chains is not about kicking in doors, it's about having agents on the ground who can supply intelligence or even infiltrate some part of the chain. Such undercover agents have already delivered intelligence that shows legitimate Chinese firms are well aware that the chemicals they sell will be used to make fentanyl. The BBC recently reported Chinese manufacturers have provided instructions on how to make fentanyl from products they sell through encrypted platforms and cryptocurrency payments. And that's exactly why Mexican cartels are now classified as terrorists. And that's why the US's most elite agencies are gearing up for war. The CIA is well aware that front companies play a key role in cartel logistics, a tactic the agency itself has mastered for covert operations. Now it's using that expertise to track these shell companies and follow the money as it moves across the globe. Investigators have uncovered how cartels use third-party countries to launder shipments, mislabeling goods in African ports before sending them on their way. This isn't just a Mexico to US operation, it's a global network. With the CIA now deeply involved, the chances of disrupting supply chains and exposing financial trails are higher than ever. With cartels now classified as terrorist organizations, the US is escalating its fight, and that likely means more aggressive tactics, possibly even a return to the CIA's dirty tricks department. The US administration has made its stance clear, calling this a war of total elimination in the country run by the cartels. The statement may have caused some red faces in Mexico, but the pressure is working. In February of 2025, Mexico deported 29 cartel members to the U.S., including high-level players. Yes, housing more cartel prisoners comes at a cost, but the real value is in what they know and what U.S. intelligence can extract from them. At the same time, Mexican military officials have traveled to Washington to discuss what will happen next. "This is historical. This has never really happened in the history of Mexico," said a former DEA chief of international operations. "The cartels will do something about this, but we'll talk about that later." There's a good chance that drone surveillance will evolve into covert operation teams going after the cartel leaders. If cartel men happen to die in these operations, it's likely the public won't know much about it. The CIA doesn't play by the same rules as law enforcement. It does what it wants. The U.S. has even suggested dropping bombs on the drug labs, although this could be viewed as excessive since it would essentially be bombing a friendly neighboring country. And if anyone ends up dying from a false positive or if there's collateral damage, it won't go down well at home or in Mexico. Someone familiar with the new anti-cartel program told the New York Times that strikes on labs likely won't happen because they, quote, would probably cause catastrophic fatalities as they're often inside homes in urban areas. With the threat of U.S. tariffs looming, Mexico agreed to deploy 10,000 additional soldiers to its northern border to curb fentanyl trafficking. However, simply boosting troop numbers won't be enough. These forces would need specialized training to take on well-armed, highly organized cartels. This is where the CIA could step in, providing intensive training for elite Mexican counter-narcotics units, equipping them with advanced tactics and cutting-edge technology to make their operations far more effective. Training would begin with surveillance and intelligence gathering, teaching units how to track cartel movements, intercept communications, and deploy CIA-backed drones and other cyber tools to disrupt trafficking networks. Additionally, covert operations training would prepare these forces for undercover infiltration and high-risk raids on cartel strongholds, ensuring they can operate stealthily and decisively in dangerous territory. With the right training, Mexico's forces could become a formidable weapon in the fight against organized crime. But Mexico also has a request of its own. Officials asked the U.S. to do more to stop the flood of American-made firearms into Mexico, guns that arm the cartels and fuel the country's staggering homicide rate. Activists argue that nearly every bullet pulled from a murder victim in Mexico might as well be labeled "Made in the USA," as are most of the guns used in cartel violence. If the U.S. cracks down on firearms exports, both legal and illegal, while Mexico tightens border security, the cartels could finally feel the squeeze, just as the CIA ramps up its pressure campaign. Let's say the U.S. does send in its Special Forces operatives on covert operations to disable the cartels completely. These are the same people who captured bin Laden, the same people who during the Cold War toppled entire governments and trained assassination squads. The CIA practically ran Latin America under Operation Condor, using brute force to ensure things went the way Washington wanted. And when the agency set its sights on a target, it usually got what it wanted, anywhere in the world. The CIA is a force of nature, and if the political will exists, it could deal a major blow to cartel operations. But this is 2025, and the days of death squads and targeted assassinations may be behind us, or maybe not. And then there's Mexico itself. The government, the people, and the nation as a whole might have something to say about the carnage unfolding within its borders. Also, unlike the governments the CIA once disabled, the cartels are decentralized. They're spread out, and if you kill one branch, others grow elsewhere, creating very violent power vacuums. Of course, the CIA knows this, so it might be reluctant to go in guns blazing. And if you're skeptical, there's always the question of whether the current situation, in some ways unknown to us, suits the CIA and the US's geopolitical objectives. We know from history that the agency very likely turned a few blind eyes to drug traffickers in the past because it served what the CIA might have called the greater good, another word for American economic and military strength. Who knows if criminal organizations are feeding intelligence to the CIA? Does it serve the U.S. strategic interests to keep part of Latin America destabilized? Could the drug trade itself, or at least the black market money it generates, somehow work to the CIA's advantage? And what about Mexico's own government? It's almost certain that some of the officials are benefiting just as they have for decades. Corrupt politicians have built empires while Americans got high and died, lining their pockets as the violence raged on. History teaches us that nothing happens in a vacuum. There's always a bigger geopolitical picture at play. In fact, former DEA agents, CIA operatives, Mexican police officers, intelligence officials, journalists, and historians have all suggested that the CIA either knew about or collaborated in the 1985 murder of DEA agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena. Why? Because the traffickers responsible were allegedly funneling drug money to fund the Nicaraguan Contra rebels. Because the CIA had a vested interest in supporting them. But let's assume this cat-and-mouse game is playing out exactly as it seems. As expected, the CIA hasn't revealed much about its latest operations. When pressed, the agency simply stated that countering drug cartels in Mexico and regionally is a priority for the CIA as part of the administration's broader efforts to end the grave threat from narco-trafficking. Beyond that, it's silence. The CIA hasn't even acknowledged its cartel surveillance drone program, let alone any covert operations in motion. So if something bigger is happening behind the scenes, we almost certainly won't hear about it. There's also been pushback from the Mexican government over the surveillance drones, with the country's defense chief Ricardo Trevilla saying, "We cannot rule out espionage." For many years now, the DEA and other U.S. law enforcement agencies have flown in Mexican airspace with the green light from the Mexican government. But these new drones could upset the apple carts in U.S.-Mexico relations. But as we said, the main problem is demand north of the border. There are still going to be millions of drug addicts and part-time users here in the U.S. as the CIA goes to war. It'll probably make the drugs more expensive, as crackdowns often do, but they'll still be there. In 2023, about 175,000 men in Mexico work for the cartels, so even if you take out the workers and the middlemen with drone hits, someone will step up and take their place. As the former Mexican counter-narcotics officer Ed Calderon has said in many interviews, the cartels pick up new members with ease because the money is so good and there's so much poverty in the country. So even if there were airstrikes and covert land attacks, people would still be lining up to replace the dead. What seems inevitable is that these crackdowns will create power vacuums, leading to even more bloodshed in Mexico. But with enough pressure, the cartels might finally be forced to abandon fentanyl, at least in the US market. That doesn't mean they'll stop trafficking drugs altogether. Instead, they're expanding elsewhere. Australia is already on their radar as a new fentanyl hotspot, and with the US surveillance and interdiction improving, cartels have begun opening new pipelines into Europe. The drug trade never stops, it just shifts to where the profits are the highest and the risks are the lowest. As long as there's demand, there will be supply. If it's not coming from Mexican cartels, it'll come from somewhere else, as you'll soon see. The US and the rest of the world have been fighting drugs for over a century. Despite this, there are stronger, cheaper, more easily available drugs than ever, after collectively trillions have been spent fighting the war. But what if drug laws became stricter? It's an ongoing debate if you can stop people from taking drugs by handing stiffer sentences to users and throwing away the key for the dealers and traffickers as they do in China, the Middle East, and Japan. In those countries, drug consumption is relatively very low, but there are also unique cultures where drugs are already quite taboo. So it's no guarantee that the hardline approach will work the same in the West. Then again, could the CIA use its psychological warfare tricks to demonize drugs and make them more taboo? It sounds outlandish, but again, history shows us the CIA is astonishingly good at manipulating hearts and minds. It's debatable whether extreme prohibition actually works in the long run. Both the Philippines and Thailand have launched brutal anti-drug campaigns, often involving extrajudicial killings of users and dealers alike. But these wars have been complicated by one major problem: corruption. In both countries, government officials, police, and even military personnel were sometimes deeply involved in the drug trade. When billions of dollars are at stake, the drug business becomes too tempting to resist. And with that comes an unstoppable flood of bribes, ensuring that no matter how many traffickers are killed, the trade continues. So no doubt, during the new crackdown in Mexico, the cartels will start spending. In 2012, reports stated they spent about $1 billion a month just to the Mexican police, but they might start throwing money at lawmakers who can deter the CIA. El Chapo once paid the former Mexican president Enrique Peña Nieto $100 million. Still, with the CIA surveillance and its large network of agents, accepting bribes could be much riskier. As for whether extreme prohibition works on the ground, now there's more methamphetamine in Thailand than ever, a country where narcotics laws are already incredibly strict. And because labs in Myanmar are producing meth at a mega industrial scale, it's now cheaper than ever. Much of the world's drug supply now comes from Myanmar, where labs look more like factories and lawless jungles. Yet, as everyone is focusing on Latin America, Myanmar is literally making billions of pills in meth factories, mountains of ice, and truckloads of heroin. And yes, they have started making fentanyl. In 2020, The Guardian reported on one of the frequent busts in the region, saying authorities swooped in on labs in the lawless Kutkai area of Shan State, seizing nearly 200 million meth tablets, 1,100 pounds of crystal meth, and 661 pounds of heroin. Imagine how much gets through. And like in the days of the Golden Triangle, a lot of it's headed for the USA. They can effectively produce much more than the Mexicans because they literally control whole regions and tens of thousands of soldiers. German media asked in 2020, "Is Southeast Asia's drug trade too big to control?" That's what happened so far in the global drug war. When you throttle just one pipeline, another one opens up. And it won't be easy fighting a drug war in the jungles of Southeast Asia against well-armed armies. The CIA must be aware this fight against drugs could change direction if the agency is successful in Mexico. So even if the war on Mexican cartels makes a difference, the gap will be filled elsewhere. In short, the CIA will have its work cut out for it. But this new war will help, and there will likely be some success. With all these overdose deaths and all the gang violence and social tragedy, something has to change. Lounging on a sun deck 30 stories above Miami's coastline, Mike adjusts the collar of his velour bathrobe. It's a gangster-style statement piece that screams Sicilian boss. Nearby, his attractive girlfriend basks in the sun, working on her tan, but secretly working for the FBI. Mike shoots her a look, a fleeting glance packed with meaning, as he swirls his cocktail. The ice clinks softly, a contrast to the tension that's simmering beneath the surface. Every movement, every detail of this rooftop act has to be flawless. The stakes couldn't be higher. Manuel Guzman steps into the room, exuding the cool confidence of a man tied to El Chapo Guzman himself, the world's most wanted drug lord. Manuel's eyes sweep the area, not just admiring the view, but checking out every detail of Mike's setup. He's here to judge, to decide if this mafioso is the real deal. But there is a glaring problem. Mike isn't from Palermo. He's from Philly, and he doesn't speak a word of Italian. And yet here he is trying to persuade El Chapo's right-hand man to agree to a deal that could change the drug trade forever. How will this play out? Find out in today's episode of The Infographics Show, the FBI agent who went undercover in a drug cartel. By the time FBI Special Agent Michael McGowan came face-to-face with Manuel Guzman, he was a seasoned veteran of the shadows. For a number of decades, he had infiltrated Italian mobsters, Russian syndicates, biker gangs, and corrupt unions, masterfully navigating the world of organized crime. Mike was the best in the business, one of the rare breed of law enforcement who thrived undercover, deep inside the world's most dangerous gangs. About 10% of FBI agents will go undercover at some point in their careers, but only a select few dedicate years, let alone decades, to living a double life. Mike did it for 30 years, taking down some of the biggest names in crime, often at a great risk to his own life. In the 1980s, Mike was a young cop working a bank robbery case when an FBI agent asked him if he'd ever considered joining the agency. Mike had a young family and he was struggling to make ends meet. The FBI offered double the pay. It was an opportunity too good to pass up. Without any specific training, he was thrown straight into the lion's den, tasked with posing as a gangster in Philadelphia's infamous Badlands. Back then, drug traffickers often transported their goods in cars and vans, outfitted with cleverly hidden secret compartments. Mike saw an opportunity. He pitched an audacious idea to his bosses. Why not set up a front company that specializes in building these contraband-safe vehicles? He'd be the one who sold them, and hopefully become a regular fixture in gangsters' lives. At that point, he had very little training in this kind of work, but he knew he'd be good at it. The key was always to do a lot more listening than speaking. Speaking could get you in trouble, and listening got you intel. So he set up that showroom selling these special cars and had a legitimate auto body company build the secret compartments. He had an informant put the word out to gangsters. If you wanted to buy a vehicle for your sketchy business, Mike was the guy to see. Soon, dealers and traffickers were lining up to get one of Mike's cars. He had so many of them coming to see him, he was sending 7 out of 10 away empty-handed. The lucky few who got keys to shiny new automobiles were the ones Mike thought were doing the most business. When they drove off the lot, the FBI tracked the car everywhere it went. A lot of guys went to prison. Mike quickly became a rising star in law enforcement, earning a reputation for his fearlessness and ingenuity. The FBI saw his potential and offered him an even bigger challenge, infiltrating organized crime and going toe-to-toe with mafia bosses. It was a dangerous proposition. Mike agreed, even though he had no idea how to act like the kind of person who does business with wise guys. All he knew was if you made a mistake, you could end up in a shallow grave. Still, he had to admit, he found this kind of work thrilling. What he needed was training, to look and sound like a first-rate criminal, to know what to say, to become authentic. So, as undercover FBI agents often do, he went to enlist the help of an informant, a real-life Italian-American mobster. That informant was Cosa Nostra captain-turned-informant, Big Ron Prevete. Prevete had been around the block. In fact, he'd been around it twice. starting his career in Philly as a highly corrupt cop. He was a mercenary who, after resigning from the force, went to work for the Philadelphia mob boss, Joey Merlino. He was a good earner and soon he became a made man, but eventually he flipped and started informing for the FBI, which is how he met Mike. He taught Mike everything he knew about being a mobster, from the way to talk and what to wear to how operations worked, and the two soon became the best of friends. And that's how Mike found himself in the position to take on Carmen D'Annunzio, better known as the Cheese Man. As Boston's mafia underboss, D'Annunzio was involved in everything from extortion rackets to smuggling contraband, including cheese. Mike was asked to go undercover and put him behind bars. The plan was simple. D'Annunzio knew guys who owned a big dirt farm, but their product contained toxic chemicals, so they couldn't sell it. An informant got word back to the FBI, and a plan was formed. To infiltrate the operation, Mike posed as a corrupt Massachusetts state officer who, for the right price, would dispose of the contaminated dirt after a bogus inspection. But playing the part of a crooked dirt inspector wasn't as simple as it sounded. Before stepping into the role, Mike spent months in what he would call dirt school, learning everything he could about the science of soil. On the day the deal was done, Mike screeched to a halt in his truck, got out, and urinated on one of the tires. The mobsters thought he was a nut and definitely not undercover FBI. He took the dirt off of D'Annunzio's hands and collected his bribe. And that's how the Big Cheese ended up behind bars. The whole case had taken just 6 months, a fairly short time for an undercover case involving the arrest of a major player. But it wasn't always like that. In one high-stakes operation, Mike posed as the getaway driver for a bank robbery. Unknown to the crew, the FBI was already waiting at the bank ready to spring the trap. The case was over in just a few days, but not before an informant helped plant Mike's name as a candidate for the job, securing his spot in the gang. It wasn't always plain sailing. On one occasion, Mike had infiltrated the Boston mob when the FBI got a call saying it was very likely that his cover had been blown. Mike convinced the FBI to let him carry on, but on the condition he only met the mobsters out in the streets, with agents hiding nearby. When Mike turned up for the next meeting, one of the mobsters motioned for him to go inside the social club where they always hung out. Mike walked into a room, thinking this could be the end of his life. Sitting at a table was the boss, Bobby Luisi. He told Mike he had something serious to discuss, but they should go down to the basement. Thoughts raced through Mike's head. This was it. If he ran, he'd likely be shot, or at least he'd ruin a long and expensive case. When they got down to the basement, rather than pull out a gun, Luisi said he wanted bigger shipments of cocaine that Mike had already arranged. Luisi was later sent down for trafficking. Luisi was later asked about that day in the basement. He said that he thought Mike was being followed by the FBI, not actually FBI, so that they'd taken him there to protect him. Mike later admitted that going into that building was a rookie mistake, one that he'd never have made in his more seasoned years. In undercover work, mistakes can be fatal, and you are incredibly lucky if you get the chance to learn from them. He had plenty of practice. Mobsters, he said, don't like strangers, but when you offer them deals with serious money, they can't resist it. He built a career on the back of greed. There was no one better than him at undercover work in all of the USA. Although it has to be said that his glory was tainted somewhat when he and another undercover agent befriended a serial killer. Mike and the agent were chatting and the agent accidentally sat on his phone. The last number rang, the number of the killer. And Mike and the agent were talking about putting him behind bars. The killer, who brazenly told the FBI to back off, remains free to this day. Despite their best efforts, the Bureau never gathered enough evidence to make the case stick. But mostly, Mike was a star in the FBI. After infiltrating 3 Cosa Nostra families, he went after the Russians. But his greatest accomplishment was what he did to El Chapo. Mike was nearing the end of his career as Chapo became the most wanted man in America, earning billions from drugs and capable of extreme violence. He was hiding out in the mountains of Sinaloa, surrounded by the firepower of a small military. Yet Mike and the FBI still thought they could get him with some solid undercover work. This is where Manuel in the snazzy Miami condo came into the story. By 2010, the years had caught up with Mike. His days of playing the young, ambitious trafficker were behind him. Balding and gray, he no longer fit the role of the up-and-coming trafficker. Instead, he had to step into a new persona, the big shot, the boss. As always, the FBI had a man on the inside. The informant told them he could get Mike a meeting with the highest echelons of the Sinaloa cartel. All he wanted in return was all the properties the FBI had seized from him. This man he was talking about was El Chapo, so naturally the FBI agreed. The informant told them El Chapo's latest trafficking ambition wasn't about selling drugs to the United States. He planned to set up a pipeline from Mexico to Europe, a continent where cocaine was in higher demand than ever before. This shift marked a bold expansion of his empire and a dangerous new challenge for law enforcement. The informant went to Mexico and told the cartel he had guys who were willing to do business and build that pipeline. The guys were Mike and a few other undercover agents. They were pretending to be a Sicilian crime organization. They wanted a meeting with the Mexicans, but on neutral territory, a high-end condominium apartment in Miami in the USA. Mike needed a Sicilian Italian-speaking agent who could pass as mafioso, but the only guy available at the FBI had just retired. It was decided that Mike would pose as the aging head honcho, the boss who quietly commanded respect from the shadows. Meanwhile, 3 other undercover agents, fluent Spanish speakers, would take the lead and do most of the talking. If Mike so much as uttered a word, the entire operation could unravel. The risk was high, but when it came to acting, Mike was the best in the business. He knew how to sell the role without a single misstep, and that is exactly how it had to go down. The condo was beautiful. From 30 floors up, you could see the Atlantic Ocean stretch for miles and miles. They fitted the room with recording equipment, video cameras, and microphones. It was staged to look like the kind of place a Sicilian gangster would stay. The plan was for the TV to be playing soccer when the Mexicans arrived, because that's what an Italian would do. Everyone involved had a script to follow. They knew where every camera was hidden, so if the Mexicans started wandering, they could guide them back to the right place. None of this would mean anything if the Mexicans during the negotiations weren't seen and heard. One of the agents was to be the master of transportation. He could get contraband anywhere in the world. He understood all the shipping routes and the international transportation systems in Europe, so he would be the one telling the Mexicans about logistics. He looked the part too, sporting designer sunglasses and a breezy, colorful shirt that captured the Miami aesthetic. Then they had Antonio, who would handle the ports in Europe. When the large shipments of cocaine are heading across the world, you need guys who have friends in the ports, where you can pay people to turn a blind eye to your cargo. The truth was, Antonio had connections with law enforcement at these ports. The third guy was Mike's pretend underling, Patricio, who was fluent in both Italian and Spanish. The narrative was that Mike was getting on in years and was considering hanging up his gloves. Patricio was the next in line to take the throne. The cover story was airtight. Mike trusted Patricio like family, as if they were bound by blood. At the meeting, Patricio would handle all the talking and report back to Mike. The dynamic of the boss sitting in the background was important because this is how it often works. The Mexicans needed to believe that Mike's underlings were not only loyal but also mortally afraid of crossing him. If they had ever the faintest suspicion that Mike wasn't the man in charge, or worse, that his crew didn't fear him, they would have walked away and flown straight back to Sinaloa. Representing El Chapo was Manuel Jesus Guzman, Chapo's trusted relative. Mike sent an undercover agent pretending to be a part of the Sicilian mob to pick him up at Miami International Airport. Back at the condo, everyone was nervous, but that was good. Overconfidence in these situations can lead to mistakes. As Manuel was on the way, Mike went to the bathroom and decided to slip into what he described as a gaudy purple velour bathrobe. He'd already been given a $5,000 suit to wear to look the part, but he felt the bathrobe was more authentic for a sleazy, rich Italian gangster. Everyone laughed when he walked out of the bathroom, but at least it calmed their nerves. Manuel was in his smart suit, looking like a regular guy about to do regular business, and walked into the room. Mike was out on the sun deck, drink in hand, catching some rays. He expected Manuel to introduce himself, but for some reason, he wouldn't go outside. It turned out he was extremely afraid of heights. He stayed in the corner of the room, which wasn't great because he was out of the camera's line of sight. Mike decided to go into the main room and briefly shake Manuel's hand. As the script demanded, no sooner than he introduced himself, he walked back out onto the sun deck. Mike's underling Patricio told Manuel that Mike wasn't a happy man. He didn't want to negotiate with anyone but El Chapo himself. After all, he was the boss of a major Italian crime family. This was an insult. So, Mike left Manuel sitting on the sofa for a couple hours as he hung out on the deck with his girlfriend. This was a young FBI agent who looked like the kind of girl a wealthy crime boss would date. Occasionally, Patricio would go out and whisper something in Mike's ear, and Mike would either nod or shake his head. At the start, Manuel didn't like this one bit. For a while, he seemed uneasy, looking like he might leave. At one point, Mike peered behind him and saw that Manuel was slapping the hand of Patricio like they had just made the deal of the century. It wasn't until hours later that Mike finally walked back inside. Even then, he kept his distance, never addressing Manuel directly. Instead, he relied on his guys to relay information into his ear, obviously in Italian that he didn't understand. Manuel laid his final offer on the table. They would start with 11,000 pounds, and if everything went smoothly, much more would follow. Patricio leaned in, whispered the proposal back to Mike. Without saying a word, Mike shook his head. "No," Patricio said. "That's too much for the first shipment, too much risk." Why would Mike be turning down a huge amount of cocaine that could see the cartel members going away for years? The answer was he was just playing it smart. He had to try to look as authentic as possible. In negotiations, you rarely agree to the first offer, and if he had, Manuel might have smelled a rat. Mike said he was setting up a system that would last for many years, so why push it before they tested how well it works? A smaller amount was fine. Manuel, a man from farming stock, agreed. After hours at the negotiating table and quite a few drinks, he was having the time of his life, and it didn't look like he wanted to leave. A few months later, the Mexicans were sending test loads through Mike's phony pipeline. These weren't drugs, they were crates of fruits shipped on Chapo's Mexican vessels so the Sinaloans could see if the Sicilians could get them through once they reached Europe. Of course, they did get through. The Sicilians weren't lying when they said they were good at their jobs. When enough trust had been built, Mike the Sicilian presented El Chapo with an offer, a thank you for his help. He called it an escape hatch plan. He said that he could safely smuggle El Chapo to Italy, far away from the many law enforcement authorities after him in Mexico and the US. Chapo declined, but still, he liked these guys. One of his men once told Mike that El Chapo respected his discipline. Chapo later offered Mike a money laundering deal. He said he had a little bit of cash to move and there was a good cut in it for him. By a little bit, he meant $500 million. Mike turned it down. Again, turning down a deal gave Mike and his guys a look of authenticity. And had they gotten involved with laundering, it could have negatively affected the trafficking setup, which had now taken almost 3 years and a lot of taxpayer money. It wasn't until 2012 that Chapo's guys shipped out about 700 pounds of top-grade cocaine, all of which was seized by the Spanish National Police, who were working with Mike and the FBI. This seizure meant Chapo and 8 of his executive board members could be charged in the USA when the time came. So when Chapo was eventually arrested in Mexico, Mike's case was one of the reasons he could be extradited to the US, and that's where he remains today. But his legacy lives on. His family and associates continue to fuel the American drug market, while European cocaine consumption has soared to staggering new heights, far beyond what anyone imagined back in 2012. The 3 Los Zetas sicarios had already been through hell. Their bodies were broken, bloodied, and battered, the results of hours of torture at the hands of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. But their suffering was far from over. After days exposed to the blistering Mexican sun, they were loaded into a truck and driven deep into the wilderness. As his men built a bonfire, El Chapo stepped forward, rifle in hand. He looked to the tear-streaked faces of the hitmen, cursed each one of them, and then pulled the trigger. One by one, their lifeless bodies hit the dirt. His men dragged them into the fire. As flames consumed the corpses, El Chapo spat on them before turning away. "Burn them well," he said. "I don't want there to even be bones left in the morning." And if you can believe it, this was one of the more tame crimes of the Sinaloa cartel, one of the most powerful, ruthless, and wealthy drug organizations in Mexico. You've probably heard their name before, but today on the Infographic Show, we're diving deeper than ever into the dark, violent world of Mexico's deadliest cartel. While El Chapo's name you probably most associate with the Sinaloas, the organization's existence can be owed to someone else, Pedro Aviles Perez. Aviles was a pioneering drug runner known by the frightening nickname the Mountain Lion and much less frightening nickname Sneaky Pete. He was nothing if not a savvy businessman, and he built up the beginnings of what would later become the Sinaloa cartel through a plucky weed smuggling operation back in the 1960s. What was unique about Aviles wasn't what he smuggled, but how he smuggled it. He was the first recorded Mexican drug runner to use aircraft to smuggle contraband into the United States. This put him head and shoulders above his competition at the time, and it made him an extremely wealthy man, with an increasingly wealthy organization behind him. His early start earned him the rare title of first-generation Mexican drug trafficker, and 2 people who worked under him, Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, would carry forward and refine the methods that Aviles innovated. Aviles himself got zeroed by Mexican federals in 1978. a move rumored to be part of an orchestrated power grab by Carrillo. Intentional or not, Carrillo and Quintero wasted no time capitalizing on the power vacuum. Along with Felix Gerardo, they formed the terrifying Guadalajara Cartel, the organization that would go on to dominate Mexico's drug trade throughout the 1980s. With virtually no one to stop them, they trafficked weed, cocaine, heroin, and more, raking in obscene amounts of cash. As long as they funneled a small portion of their fortune into the right government hands, they were untouchable. Things were going well for the gaggle of thieves and killers that made up the Guadalajara syndicate, until their lust for money and power at any costs had them fly just a little too close to the sun. Specifically, with the brutal murder of American Drug Enforcement Agency member Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar in 1985. The murder of Agent Kiki was one of revenge and intimidation. In 1984, a DEA tip-off allowed the Mexican army to find and torch a massive Guadalajara marijuana grow operation, costing the cartel millions. Believing that Kiki's work was the source of the leak, the cartel tracked him down and eventually had some corrupt Mexican police officials kidnap him in broad daylight on February 7, 1985. What followed for Kiki was nothing short of a living nightmare, and it would be the last thing he ever experienced. Kiki was dragged to one of Quintero's residences in Guadalajara, a place that would soon become his prison and torture chamber. Later that same day, he was joined by another captive, pilot Alfredo Zavala Avelar, a man who had flown alongside Kiki on missions and was now about to share his fate. There, the two men would be brutally tortured for 30 straight hours, with their torturers alternating in shifts to inflict maximum pain. They were beaten with rebar and other blunt instruments, breaking ribs and puncturing skulls. The bodies of Kiki and Avelar were also injected with lidocaine. The aim was to keep them awake to fully experience the torture that they were being dealt. In the end, when the Guadalajara men got bored, they riddled the two with bullets, wrapped them in plastic, and then loaded them into the back of a truck. Their corpses would later be found dumped by the roadside. However, killing Kiki turned out to be a disastrous mistake for the Guadalajara cartel. His murder infuriated the DEA and pressured Mexican authorities to crack down harder than ever, not just to seek justice but to avoid losing face. In the years that followed, the cartel's key players, including Gallardo and Quintero, were hunted down and incarcerated. Authorities had cut off the head of the snake, and naturally the body collapsed soon after. By the late 1980s, the once mighty Guadalajara cartel had shattered, splintering into three smaller competing factions. Some of those offshoots formed the Tijuana cartel, but three ambitious Guadalajara veterans, Hector Luis Palma Salazar, Juan Jose Esparragosa, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, had bigger plans. Together, they founded the Sinaloa cartel. And as luck or fate would have it, as the Sinaloa cartel solidified its position in the early 90s, its founders found themselves stepping into a booming black market for illicit substances. 1993 marked the end of an era with the death of Pablo Escobar and the collapse of his Medellin cartel. Around that same time, a major crackdown on drug trafficking in the Caribbean forced cartels to find new smuggling routes. With both Colombia and the Caribbean effectively removed from play, Mexico emerged as the most viable gateway to the lucrative U.S. drug market. Thanks to America's strict drug laws, demand remained sky high, and for Mexico's cartel, that meant big business. The new kids on the block, the Sinaloa, were eager to expand their market share in this top-dollar business. But there was one big problem facing the Sinaloa cartel from the outset. In order to get their drugs to the U.S., they needed to move them through the Tijuana corridor, which put them in direct combat with their former Guadalajara allies who had formed the Tijuana cartel. And things got extremely messy extremely quickly. If they wanted to win the war against the Tijuana cartel, they needed an ace up their sleeve, and El Chapo found that ace in Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a man who would later become one of his closest and most valuable allies. El Mayo was a freelance trafficker who was an evil genius when it came to logistics. He had a sixth sense for sniffing out valuable drug trafficking routes and was able to work with and manage other traffickers. With El Mayo on their side, they were able to slowly chip away at their Tijuana rivals in a war of attrition. It seemed like the Sinaloa cartel were almost destined to win. Drug businesses have a mantra very similar to real estate companies: location, location, location. That's because manufacturing and selling drugs is an extremely geographically sensitive industry. You need the ideal climate as well as plenty of space and cover to cultivate your wares. You also need control over key smuggling routes without the risk of authorities cracking down or your competition heading you off at the pass. In this regard, Sinaloa territory has been a vital component of their massive success. The Sinaloa cartel's base of operations sat in the heart of Mexico's Golden Triangle, the rugged region where Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua meet. This remote mountainous terrain, fortified by the Sierra Madre Range, provided the perfect stronghold for a criminal empire. From this natural fortress, the cartel expanded rapidly, growing into a multinational powerhouse. At the height of its power, Sinaloa had a presence in at least 21 Mexican states and extended its operations to 50 countries worldwide. Much like Pedro Aviles Perez decades before him, El Chapo set himself apart from the other ex-Guadalajara lieutenants running Sinaloa with his relentless drive for innovation. One of his most infamous breakthroughs was his extensive use of subterranean tunnels for drug smuggling, a technique that he also used to escape prison in 2015. El Chapo was first locked up in 1993 for his crimes, at which point El Mayo continued running the organization and taking its distribution game to new heights. He helped expand the Juarez cartel in this time and began what was almost akin to a corporate merger between the two cartels, weighted to the Sinaloa cartel's benefit overall. In short, things were coming up roses, and the best was yet to come. By 1995, as rival drug lords were being killed or imprisoned, El Chapo had managed to tighten his grip on the Sinaloa cartel, all from behind prison walls. Even locked up, he was calling the shots, using his influence to expand his empire. With rival cartels weakened by leadership losses, he instigated brutal turf wars, seizing their territories piece by piece. Before long, both Tijuana and Juarez had fallen under his control, and Sinaloa's reach had stretched to unprecedented and terrifying new heights. He proved his wiliness yet again when he escaped from prison in 2001 by hiding in a laundry basket. This allowed him to take a more active role in the running of the organization yet again. Another key advantage that set the Sinaloa cartel apart was its willingness to diversify. While older cartels focused primarily on marijuana or cocaine, Sinaloa expanded its product line, transforming itself into a one-stop shop for illicit drugs. Over time, they trafficked marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, and most infamously, fentanyl, the deadly opioid now devastating communities across the U.S. And while they also took in extra profit through money laundering operations, unlike a lot of other cartels, they never extended their business practices to human trafficking. This move was likely more tactical than moral. Human trafficking is a crime that easily unites public outrage, and it would have drawn intense law enforcement scrutiny to the Sinaloa cartel. Avoiding it wasn't about ethics, it was about staying under the radar. And besides, why not stick to what you're good at? Their operational wisdom was paying off. By 2015, they controlled the drug market in almost every Mexican state, giving them annual revenue anywhere from $3 to $39 billion. To put that into perspective, at the high end, the Sinaloa cartel would be making well over the double annual revenue of Trader Joe's. While the Sinaloa cartel is capable of truly stomach-churning acts of violence, and we'll get to those later, they often operated differently from the more openly brutal cartels like Los Zetas and the Juarez cartel. Rather than relying solely on fear and bloodshed, Sinaloa preferred to work in the shadows, using hefty bribes to keep the cops and politicians in line. That strategy held strong until everything changed in 2019, after El Chapo was sentenced to life in an American supermax prison where not even his most loyal allies could reach him. The Sinaloa cartel has always faced challenges, from law enforcement stings to rival cartels to even their own members splitting away and becoming threats to them. For example, the Beltran Leyva brothers, important members of the Sinaloa operation, split away from the group in 2008 to form the Beltran Leyva organization. They made their animosity clear when they gunned down one of El Chapo's sons, a move that seemed to be retaliation for what they saw as a betrayal. They believed El Chapo hadn't done enough to get one of their brothers out of jail. And after El Chapo's permanent incarceration in the U.S., which was kicked off with his arrest in 2016, internal struggles and warring factions have weakened the cartel's standing. On one side are the Los Chapitos, El Chapo's remaining sons, whose brutality know no bounds. They've been known to torture victims with corkscrews and even feed people to their pet tigers. On the other, El Mayo, the logistical mastermind behind Sinaloa's greatest successes, a man so essential that without him the cartel's empire might never have existed. Though this power struggle may have already been decided by external forces, there are reports that El Mayo, as well as one of El Chapo's sons, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, have been in U.S. custody, incarcerated pending trial as of summer 2024. So, it is reasonable to wonder at this point, what is the state of the Sinaloa cartel today? What's the structure of its organization, and how has it remained in a position of power for so long, while its rival cartels have often been weakened or collapsed? In discussing the Guadalajara cartel earlier, and specifically its collapse, we used the metaphor that once the snake's head is cut off, the body dies. Part of the reason behind the Sinaloa cartel's longevity is that they're less like a snake and more like a whole pit of vipers. The head of the Sinaloa cartel is almost like the President of the United States. They oversee a kind of federal law, and they set the group's primary directive. But rather than the organization being a single mass, it's instead a decentralized collection of smaller territorial organizations. Each of these are capable of acting with a high degree of autonomy, even when the head of the group is trapped in a United States supermax. Each of the cells have a high degree of cooperation, and rather than put their key domestic operatives at risk in international operations, the Sinaloa cartel works with international partners to oversee their interests and operations overseas. Each one of the cells also has an armed contingent, known informally as a mini-army, who defend their turf and carry out their own violent wishes. For example, Los Chapitos operate as one faction, but the mini-army they command is made up of several notorious groups: Los Ninis, the Salazar, Gente Nueva, and the Chimales. At first glance, this seems like a recipe for disaster. After all, these groups are violent, power-hungry, and likely to be on a lot of drugs. But somehow, the Sinaloa cartel has managed to keep the chaos in check, avoiding the kind of internal implosion that has crippled the other cartels. Valentin Perada, an assistant professor at the School of Criminology at the Université de Montréal, has identified the Sinaloa cartel's surprising internal structure as the reason for its relative stability. Unlike other cartels plagued by infighting and betrayal, Sinaloa has maintained order through a democratic process and advanced mediation systems, allowing them to resolve disputes without collapsing into chaos. This approach has kept internal conflicts far less destructive compared to their more volatile rivals. Grievances within the group are often addressed with negotiation and restitution rather than might makes right violence. And of how the group coordinates its cells, Perada said, the cartel has prioritized consensus building amongst its leaders when making pivotal decisions. This unity has enabled the cartel to present a unified front when initiating conflicts or embarking on significant business ventures. For day-to-day decisions, the cartel has also found great success in delegating tasks to its lower-level, local cartel bosses. The drug business, it seems, is not one that benefits from industry leaders being control freaks. Even if he was willing to cut his subordinates some slack, El Chapo was still extremely paranoid throughout his reign. He invested millions into surveillance and spyware technology to both keep his own communications secure while allowing him to spy on everyone else close to him. He said to one friend regarding this attitude, "The most important thing in that environment was to know what everyone was thinking about you. Whoever, your friends, your enemies, your compadres." The Sinaloa cartel's methods of smuggling, conflict mediation, and governance are shockingly sophisticated for a criminal organization. But when it comes to how they treat people on the ground, especially their enemies, their brutality is downright medieval. There's no way to discuss why Sinaloa remains Mexico's deadliest cartel without peering into the utter darkness of the horrific ways they have tortured, killed, and brutalized those who stood in their way. Because when negotiation and bribery fail, Sinaloa's real face is revealed. As we alluded to at the start of the video, the cartel's former top dog, El Chapo, is definitely not afraid to personally get his hands dirty. Whether it's tenderizing zetas before throwing them onto a bonfire, or the terrifying brutality that he and his men meted out to rival drug pusher Israel Rincon Martinez. Rincon was captured by Sinaloa enforcers and taken back to one of El Chapo's properties. There, he was brutally tortured by beatings, having electric shocks inside of his ears, and having his teeth pulled out. When Rincon fell unconscious from the sheer levels of pain he was undergoing, El Chapo brought in his personal doctor to patch up and revive Rincon so he could be fully conscious for the rest of his torture. And if that wasn't horrific enough, the entire thing was filmed and then posted onto YouTube before Rincon's dead body was dropped in the streets to rot. Another nightmarish incident saw El Chapo turn his own personal attention to a member of the rival Arellano Felix cartel, with whom he took plenty of time systematically beating and burning all around his body. One witness, a former hitman, said he had burns made with an iron on his back. His shirt was stuck to his skin. He had burns made with a car lighter all over his body. His feet were burned. The man was imprisoned for days while inside a sweltering wooden shack, suffering in the unforgiving heat. When he was finally dragged out, El Chapo stood over him, handgun in hand, pressing for any last scraps of valuable information. Then he pulled the trigger, but that shot wasn't fatal. Still alive, the man was dumped into a shallow grave, bleeding and helpless. El Chapo gave the final order. His men buried the fallen Arellano Felix enforcer alive. And El Chapo's brutality wasn't even all business. During his trial, it came out that he had long been a terror to women and teenage girls under his rule, which feels almost as disgusting as the way he liked to treat his enemies. And the rotten apples don't fall that far from the rotten tree. Los Chapitos are every bit as sadistic as their dad. Los Chapitos maintain a private ranch in Sinaloa, a place where they keep exotic pets and strange, extravagant interrogations, a term that barely scratches the surface of the pure sadism that unfolds there. Here, captured enemies are subjected to horrific cruelty, with Los Chapitos taking their time, ensuring that every moment is as agonizing as possible. Victims have corkscrews twisted into their flesh and muscle, only to have them yanked out with savage force. They are then shocked with cattle prods, their open wounds rubbed with chili juice, and their bodies beaten black and blue, all while their friends, families, and loved ones are threatened in front of them. And once Los Chapitos have extracted every last bit of information, whether their victim is dead or barely clinging to life, their body is tossed into a tiger pit where they're devoured by the cartel's hungry pets. You don't even need to be involved in the cartel drug wars to get an awful death from the Sinaloa forces. Earlier this year, 22-year-old Mexican YouTuber Agustin El Pinky Paul was tortured and interrogated on camera by a hitman linked to the Sinaloa cartel. His body was found the next day, having been killed by a gunshot, his arms and legs bound. Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, better known as El Nini, served as the security chief for the Sinaloa cartel. And before his extradition to the US, he was also famed for his terrible brutality. He even had a custom-built murder chamber inside of his home, a room designed purely for torture and execution. The chamber featured restraints to hold victims in place and a drain in the center of the floor, a grim necessity for washing away the copious amounts of blood that would inevitably stain the walls. It might seem like pure barbarism, and on some level it is, but it's also the level of cruelty needed to give the Sinaloa cartel the edge in the seemingly endless cartel wars. The one immutable truth about all of this is that no matter who wins the cartel wars, it's the innocents caught in the crossfire that really lose. In the municipality of La Union Isidoro Montes de Oca, nestled deep within Mexico's Guerrero region, a horrifying scene plays out. Two men, a father and presumably his son, lie on the cold ground, their hands bound tightly behind their backs. The father screams as his captors beat him without mercy, before issuing a chilling warning. His entire family will experience a similar fate. Then, one of the men takes out a knife, its blade glinting in the light. He presses it to the father's throat, slowly drawing blood, while the boy is forced to watch every agonizing momenta. And that's only the start. There's a lot more to come as we reveal the shocking extremes of cartel violence in today's episode of the Infographic Show, Most Brutal Torture Methods by Mexican Cartels, Part 2. Number 10. Guerrero Flaying. Flaying, a gruesome process where the skin is painstakingly removed from the body, is among the cartel's most excruciating methods of torture. With precise control over the initial cuts, the victim's agony can be prolonged for hours, even days, as they bleed out slowly. This was the horrifying punishment that a father and son faced in 2018, and their ordeal recorded on video for the world to see. The perpetrators were allegedly linked to the infamous Sinaloa cartel, a shadowy empire built on violence, fear, and loyalty. Known for their ruthless enforcement of power, the cartel operates with an iron fist, leaving no room for betrayal. In this case, the victim's past connections with the cartel sealed their grim fate. The father was referred to as a grasshopper, a derogatory term for a cartel member who provides information to an opposing cartel or law enforcement. The father had admitted to snitching to another cartel, and the interrogator then spoke directly to the camera, announcing what would happen to every snitch that the cartel finds. The father was severely beaten, something that started before the cartel began filming. Then one member starts cutting the man's throat. The man suffers an agonizing death, all while his son is forced to watch, while trying to back away from his father's death. After that, it's the boy's turn. The executioner repeatedly hits the boy, who is gagged and screaming. Tears stream down his face as he is forced onto his father's lifeless body. What follows is an unimaginable act of cruelty, designed not just to punish, but to send a gruesome message. The executioner takes a knife, targeting the boy's limbs to prolong his suffering rather than end his life. It is clear this nightmare is far from over. Then the flaying begins again. The executioner methodically cuts into the boy's chest, his screams filled with agony as cartel members hold him down. One enforcer presses a rifle against the boy's forehead, ensuring compliance. Yet the cuts are shallow, calculated to avoid fatal blood loss. The boy drifts in and out of consciousness, overwhelmed by the sheer shock and torment. The executioner begins stripping muscles from his ribs, inflicting unimaginable pain. The torture doesn't end there. It culminates in the mutilation of the boy's body and the removal of his organs. The brutality ends with the cartel claiming that this will be the so-called gift that they have for snitches and the opposition. Flaying is primarily meant to send a message, just like this next method. Number 9. Group murder. In 2014, the disappearance of 43 male students in the Guerrero region prompted nationwide demonstrations. The students had traveled to the area to protest discriminatory hiring practices in government offices. According to the student union, the students hitchhiked to the protest, but various news reports stated that over 100 students were aboard 3 buses being driven to the protest, with plans to return. On the return trip, the vehicles were stopped by local police, who at some point opened fire on the vehicles. Panicked students ran for cover or were killed on the spot. Others were taken into custody, at least according to official police reports. The police then handed the students in custody over to the Guerreros Unidos, an offshoot of the Beltran-Leyva cartel. Out of the 43 students who disappeared, presumably all in the cartel's custody at that point, only 3 bodies were ever recovered. The first was a 22-year-old student found the day after the kidnapping. The autopsy revealed he had been beaten severely with over 64 bone fractures across his face, skull, and spine. The student's body showed signs of flaying, but the authorities suggested that thankfully this gruesome act was performed post-mortem. However, investigators also suggested that the flaying may have been caused by animals, possibly the exotic pets kept by prominent cartel members, including lions and tigers. The theory would mean the student was brutally beaten to death before his body was left as prey. While no one has ever found the bodies of the remaining students, all of them were likely killed relatively shortly after being transferred over to the cartel. The leading theory points to the protest they were planning as a potential threat to delicate negotiations. These negotiations allegedly involved the local mayor's wife and other influential figures in the region, individuals suspected of working closely with the cartel. By silencing the students, the cartel could protect their allies and maintain their grip on local power structures. Cartels are also known to use buses to transport and smuggle drugs, so buses moving across the region might have been interpreted as actions by an opposing cartel, which could have prompted the attack. The students who were tortured and killed met that fate by entering cartel territory by mistake. But what happens to people who are intentionally targeted for information? Number 8. Waterboarding. The answer might lie with someone on the other side of the torture fence, a man who once made disappearing people his grim profession for the cartel. This assassin, who likes to portray himself as a humble cattle farmer, admits to occasionally handling cartel targets. The disappearing in this case is shorthand for kidnapping, information extraction, torture, execution, and disposal of the body in a place where it won't be found. The man stated that what he does is purely because the cartels often have more influence in the region than the law enforcement. In the absence of police, one cartel effectively provides protection against the others. The killer said that he preferred 3 particular methods for torturing, all with the goal of getting information the cartel needs from the victim. The first method is brutal, yet timeless: beatings. Though simple, they remain devastatingly effective in breaking both body and spirit. The second method, waterboarding, is a form of psychological and physical torment that goes beyond cartel violence, with a history of use spanning centuries across the globe. We'll discuss the third method in a moment. At its core, waterboarding is a brutal yet bloodless torture method. The victim is tied face up on a board with a thin cloth or towel covering their nose and mouth. The torturer pours a small amount of water over the cloth, which prevents the passage of air. Almost immediately, the victim's gag reflex tries to activate and expel the water, which is ineffective if they're immobilized. Then the water starts drowning the victim. To extend the torture, water is poured intermittently, with the victim allowed short periods of breathing before waterboarding resumes. A single session of torture typically lasts for 20 minutes, involving repeated cycles of pouring water to simulate drowning. The victim is usually allowed brief moments to gasp for air, but the process is usually repeated 3 or 4 times. However, if torture persists, the water causes lung damage and oxygen deprivation. Even if the victim doesn't die from drowning, they could be left with severe brain damage. Previously, waterboarding was thought to only simulate drowning by intermittent water exposure. This was later proven false, as the effect is identical to being drowned in a large body of water, with all the potential side effects and deadliness. Number 7. Electroshock torture. The third method that the anonymous disappearer used was electric shock. The South American picana is perhaps the most recognizable electroshock torture implement. The picana is derived from cattle prods, and it uses a high-voltage, low-current shock. This means that it's less likely to kill the victim, but still inflicts severe nerve damage and burns to the surrounding area. It's particularly effective as a torture method. The cartels have adapted the picana by repurposing uninsulated wiring to deliver jolts of electricity with similar properties. For a simpler approach, police tasers are sometimes used, requiring fewer modifications to achieve a comparable effect. In either case, the result is the same: a searing jolt of pain concentrated on a small area of the body. To increase the torment, victims are often doused with water. It allows the current to penetrate deeper and spread further from the source, intensifying the pain and increasing the psychological toll. The Mexican disappearer said that the shocks were typically given to the soles of the feet, the testicles or the genitals, and the tongue. The genitals and the tongue have more nerve endings than other parts of the body on average, which only amplifies the painful effect of the torture. By focusing on the soles, the victim would be unable to stand or walk afterward. The disappearer, a cattle farmer by trade, has no formal military or intelligence training, nor was he ever instructed in the art of torture. Yet, despite his lack of professional expertise, he claims to have killed at least 30 people. He said he learned which torture methods work best solely via personal experience and hands-on training. But perhaps even more effective methods of torture are psychological rather than physical ones, of which the cartel has utilized a few different types. Number 6. Gladiatorial combat. One of the most notable cases of mass murder and torture occurred in 2010 when a Mexican cartel abducted men from passenger buses for seemingly no apparent reason. Law enforcement found at least 193 bodies across 48 mass graves a year later. Most of the bodies were found to have blunt force injuries, believed to be from a sledgehammer. The deaths are suspected to be connected to the Zetas drug cartel, considered to be the most brutal cartel when it comes to killing. Authorities believe that the Zetas abducted the men and gave them a seemingly simple choice: work for the Zeta cartel or die. Those who accepted the work offer would likely be folded into the cartel's operation for their entire lives. Those who refused were likely given sledgehammers and ordered to fight each other. It's unknown what happened to the victor of the makeshift gladiatorial arena, as there is no winning when you go against the entire cartel. The men could have been promised their lives back if they killed the others, which only added to the emotional trauma they could experience. Most likely, the entire event was used as a show of force to the new members that the cartel obtained during the kidnappings. Whether someone managed to score a kill with a sledgehammer over another unsuspecting victim likely didn't matter, as the winner was probably executed shortly after. A similar situation happened much more recently in 2023, when a group of 5 students was kidnapped by a cartel. A video that circulated at the same time showed a cartel group tossing a brick to someone later identified to be one of the kidnapped students. The video contained an image with the text "Puro MZ" over it, allegedly a reference to the former Sinaloa cartel boss El Mayo Zambada. The video showed some of the students bound, gagged, and apparently put on display. The brick handler seems to have been forced to maim and injure his friends in various ways, including with the brick. Before the remains of the 4 students were discovered, a body was found in a burned-out vehicle. It was never confirmed that the burned body was indeed the 5th student, but it is highly likely. But as we've seen earlier, brutality isn't limited to students. Cartels aren't above torturing and executing families, no matter the age of the members. Number 5. Axing. After ordering a series of brutal killings, Marciano Chano Milan Vasquez, the former regional leader of the Los Zetas cartel, was finally captured in 2015. Witnesses to Vasquez's crimes corroborated that he was responsible for at least 18 deaths, but 3 of those were particularly brutal. By some accounts, Vasquez took a family of 3 hostage. Presumably, the father was the actual target of Vasquez's brutality, likely due to his being affiliated with other cartels or failing to obey Zeta's orders. After kidnapping the family, Vasquez's men sat the father down and held his head by the hair, so he would be forced to keep his eyes open to watch what was about to happen to the rest of his family. Vasquez then took an axe and started attacking the man's family. According to the witnesses, this was all done so the father would remember Vasquez. Then the father himself suffered the same fate. Their body parts were later burned and dispersed, so they couldn't be found by law enforcement. The extent of Vasquez's and the Zetas' brutality didn't stop there, of course. Other witnesses corroborated that dismemberment was likely the cartel leader's favored modus operandi when it came to killing, with at least 4 other victims dying the same way. The witnesses at Vasquez's trial were also victims, as they were either blindfolded and held prisoner for ransom or forced to watch the brutal deaths of those around them. In truth, there is no reason for why some of the cartel leaders behave the way they do. They hold the reins of power, so they use it as they see fit. It doesn't matter if their victims, like the many families that were killed over the decades, are related to cartel activities. In essence, they are merely a means to an end for cartel leadership, to send a clear message of what various cartel members would do to their opposition. Number 4. Cannibalism. In the corporate world, ruthless CEOs sometimes have a saying, "Eat or be eaten." On some occasions, the cartels take that literally. Yes, we are referring to actual cannibalism. Even cartel members in good standing are sometimes forced to take part in this ritual by their leadership. The first of such allegations of cannibalism centered around the CJ&G cartel, among the most brutal offshoots of the Milenio cartel. To insulate their men against outside interference, cartel leadership devised strategies to make them more hardened to the stress of being in the organization. But it was also to promote loyalty to leadership. This led to an unprecedented tactic that would become an open secret across the country. The CJ&G didn't just stop at kidnapping, torturing, and murdering their victims. They wanted to put the cartel members above the rest of the people, making them more than humans. So the victims would be used as training grounds for members being promoted into the cartel. First, the prospective members would be trained on the most effective and brutal methods of hacking away digits, fingers or toes, or entire limbs. And then the trainees were told to eat the severed digits to earn the approval of the leaders. When they became desensitized to eating fingers, they would move on to larger body parts until they became fully accepting of eating human flesh. However, the consequence of failing to eat human flesh was severe. If anyone vomited, the instructors would retrieve the half-digested fingers and shove them back into the trainees' mouths to repeat the process. The dehumanizing training didn't stop at eating bodies either. Recruits were also forced to live and sleep next to corpses, an extreme tactic meant to drill into them that they weren't like the rest of humanity anymore. This brutal months-long process was all about breaking down their empathy and self-identity. Living so close to death meant that they would essentially become shells of their former selves and become slaves to the cartel leadership. Not to be outdone, Miguel Trevino Z40 Morales, the ruthless leader of the Zetas, reportedly took things to another level. The Drug Enforcement Agency claims he personally killed over 500 people and even ate the hearts of his victims, believing it would make him invincible against his enemies. In most cases, Morales would use knives, bats, or even hangings to execute his enemies. He would force cartel members to either be observers or even take part in the process, with Morales' men being witness to brutal, lengthy, often innovative methods of torture. They would be more likely to stay in line and not even attempt to double-cross the organization. Number 3. It's all in the legs. Miguel Z40 Morales was one of the few regular users of the stew method for killing and disposing of bodies. But as with many cartel leaders, there's even more brutality to this man. In one case, Morales found out that one of his hitmen was dating an 18-year-old girl who was also dating a Mexican soldier. Morales kidnapped both the girl and her mother with plans to execute them. The crime? The girl's relationship with a soldier might mean that she could be sending information about the cartel. Morales first killed the mother with a submachine gun while the girl was forced to watch. The girl was in so much pain at this point, she was begging to be killed. When she could no longer stand up, she was executed. Number 2. Death by dog. In 2019, a man reportedly in his 30s allegedly attacked and assaulted a woman. Whether he was actually convicted by the local law enforcement was unclear. What was clear, however, is that the local drug gang, which was likely part of a larger cartel, wanted to exact its own revenge as soon as possible. A few gang members attacked the man and filmed the entire process for the rest of the world to see. The man was handcuffed so he couldn't run or fight back. Then, the gang pinned him to the ground with the same bats they used to maul him. And then came the dogs. The gang unleashed one of their pit bulls to inflict a frenzied attack, while the victim pleaded for mercy. The video was uploaded shortly after, presumably as a warning to other men who might be considering the same crime. It's unclear what happened to the man in the videos, as there are no reports of whether he was found by the authorities or taken to a hospital. It's likely that the gang just left the man to die somewhere or executed him to end the supposed message. Number 1. Police brutality. In some cases, the actual police might be as bad as the cartels themselves. In fact, many officers are part of the cartels. So how could Mexicans trust their law enforcement system when the cartels, for better or worse, are likely a significant part of it? While the police have been fighting the cartels for years, not everyone on the force plays by the book. Some officers have been known to bend the rules, pinning crimes on innocent people if it suits their agenda, especially when it helps the cartel. This blurred line between law enforcement and organized crime has led to cartel-style torture methods creeping into police practices themselves. As we mentioned earlier, police are suspected of being involved in the disappearance and the assassination of 43 students in 2014. Meanwhile, in 2021, Mexican authorities arrested former federal police commander Luis Cardenas Palomino on charges of being involved with the torture and kidnapping of a suspect in 2012. The connection to the cartels? Well, Cardenas Palomino is believed to have taken bribes in the millions of dollars from the infamous Sinaloa cartel and its one-time leader, the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. We're talking about the federal police commander here, so it is clear the connection between law enforcement and the cartels runs pretty deep. That's not the only evidence of a substantial cartel presence in the police force. In June 2005, the Mexican government suspended the entire police force of Nuevo Laredo for corruption and their close involvement with drug cartels. Eventually, of the 765 officers on the force, 305 were fired, 41 were fired for attacking federal officers when they arrived to replace them. Police doing the dirty work for cartels doesn't just stop at flexing their muscle over mere civilians. In August 2010, even the mayor of Santiago fell victim. Alone at home while his wife and children were in Texas, Edamiro Cavazos answered his door only to be greeted by armed assailants and a fleet of cars. Cavazos was shoved into one of the vehicles, whisked away, and later found dead by the side of the road. He became one of 14 mayors who were killed that year alone. So how did cartel gunmen get so close to the mayor of a tourist town like Santiago? Easy, with the help of local police who not only allowed the gunmen to approach but greeted them as they arrived. They basically opened the door and let the cartel inside. In all, 6 officers were involved in the abduction and killing. The cartels use brutal torture methods as a way to build up their reputation. It keeps their members, opponents, and bystanders in line. When faced with working for and around the cartels or death or torture, most people would inevitably choose the former option. This keeps the cartels growing and unchecked, and even lets them publicize their acts for future generations and maintain their legacy. January 2, 2010. It's a warm night in Mexico's Sonora state when 36-year-old Hugo Hernandez is taking an evening walk. He has no idea that in the next few days his name will be in newspapers all over the world for the most horrifying reason imaginable. As he walks, he barely registers the van approaching from behind until it pulls up next to him and the side panel slides open. Several men in ski masks pile out and make a run for Hernandez. They beat him down, zip-tie his wrists, and pull a black sack over his head. In a matter of seconds, the human cargo is bundled up into the back of the van, which speeds away from the curb with a screech of tires. He's just been kidnapped by sicarios from the Sinaloa drug cartel, one of the most feared and powerful drug cartels in all of Mexico. But Hugo's ordeal isn't over, not by a long shot. He's about to find out exactly why the Sinaloas command so much terror. When Hugo Hernandez wakes up, he's in Sinaloa territory. The sicarios beat him viciously, while one among their numbers readies a chainsaw. This is where everything gets messy, both in the room where Hernandez is being held and in our knowledge of the story. We don't know for sure whether Hernandez was alive when they expertly peeled off his face. We don't know if he was alive when they cut off every one of his limbs before tearing his head from his torso. We can only hope for Hugo's sake that they were feeling merciful that day. What we do know is what happened afterward. On January 8th, after the sicarios are finished with Hugo, his torso and all of the limbs that used to be attached to it turn up in 2 large plastic containers on the streets of Los Mochis. Hugo's face, meticulously stitched onto a soccer ball, is found in a plastic bag near City Hall, with a note that reads, "Happy New Year, because this will be your last." Because when it comes to the dark art of violence and torture, the drug cartels of Mexico are nothing if not disgustingly creative. You've heard the stories: shootings, stabbings, decapitations. It's all true. And what's more, it's generally underselling just how brutal agents and even leaders of Mexico's biggest drug cartels can be. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and one of the most competitive in the world. It's why some of Mexico's leading drug cartels like the Sinaloas and the Zetas need to go so above and beyond in establishing that they're not to be messed with. And leading the charge is Joaquin Guzman, the now incarcerated leader of the Sinaloa drug cartel. And you might know him better by his nickname, El Chapo, Shorty in English. And if the career of Joe Pesci has taught us anything, it's that the little guys with a homicidal streak are some of the scariest gangsters of all. Let's take a look at some of the ways that El Chapo has redefined brutality even as drug cartels go, with some of his uniquely strange and sadistic torture methods, starting with how he saw fit to punish rival drug peddler Israel Rincon, aka El Huacho. According to unsealed court documents, El Chapo's men got a hold of Rincon and dragged him into a garden outhouse on one of his properties. There, the torture began. While cartel agents filmed the interrogation, Rincon's teeth were ripped out, and he was electrocuted in the ear. He was beaten and humiliated as they extracted information from him. But eventually the pain got to be too much for Rincon to bear, and he fell unconscious. At this point, the Sinaloa torturers called in a doctor to treat and revive El Huacho so they could continue torturing him. Once the torturers got bored, they murdered Rincon and disposed of his body in Culiacan before posting the footage of the brutal torture to the internet. And what happened to Rincon was only the tip of the iceberg. El Chapo is a hands-on torture enthusiast. While he often delegates his acts of brutality to some of his countless underlings, he's also more than happy to roll up his sleeves and get to torturing himself. According to one eyewitness, he beat 2 people with a branch until their bodies were, quote, like rag dolls from so many broken bones, before having them thrown into a bonfire. Another incident had him non-fatally shoot a rival cartel boss before ordering that the man be buried alive to slowly suffocate. A witness at El Chapo's trial, Isaías Valdez Rios, described the latter's torture as follows. He had burns made with an iron on his back. His shirt was stuck to his skin. He had burns made with a car lighter all over his body. His feet were burned. It was only after days of being left for dead in an old wooden structure that El Chapo saw fit to bury the man. But torture and abuse weren't just business for El Chapo. According to his former associate, Alex Cifuentes, it was also pleasure. Cifuentes claimed that he and El Chapo abused young girls while they lived together, with Chapo claiming that doing so kept him young, describing the girls as his vitamins. That last one might have you thinking, wow, El Chapo's friends sound just as sadistic and torture-happy as he is. And yes, you'd be correct. One of the drug lord's most trusted associates, Antonio Jaguar Marufo, had a special room in his mansion built specifically for torture and the murder of their rivals in the drug trade. The room had a fitted drain in the ground to let the blood drain away more easily, as well as non-stick tiles and soundproofing technology to stop anyone on the outside from hearing the horrific screams from within. El Chapo's apples didn't fall far from the tree either. His sons, Ivan and Alfredo Guzman Salazar, and Joaquin and Ovidio Guzman Lopez, formed their own Sinaloa splinter cartel known as Los Chapitos, or Little Chapos, along with close El Chapo associate, hitman Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, aka El Nini. As you probably predicted by now, they share their old man's love of horrific torture and keep a ranch in Navolato where the worst of it takes place. People close to the matter have reported that they twist corkscrews into the flesh of their victims before yanking them out and then rubbing hot chili peppers into the open wounds. Some are fed, either dead or alive, depending on how lucky they are, to the tigers some of El Chapo's sons keep as pets. They're also known for making drug mules out of the local civilians, in many cases killing them and their families if they refuse the offer. But Mexico's cartel community isn't going to let the Sinaloa syndicate have all the fun. There are plenty of horrific instances of violence and torture from El Chapo's many competitors. And now we're going to take you on a traumatic crash course through some of the worst ones. Seriously, we're begging you, put down that sandwich. It's going to get really, really gross. Probably one of the most infamous cases of cartel torture was the one committed against DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985, when his undercover investigation was blown open by members of the ruthless Guadalajara cartel. Kiki's death was anything but quick, as his captors saw fit to torture him to death over the course of 30 grueling and humiliating hours. On February 7, 1985, he was ambushed by a group of armed men in Guadalajara on the way to the U.S. consulate. He went without a struggle, knowing that he was outmatched, and he was taken to a secondary location where the torture commenced. He was bound to a chair while the cartel torturers recorded the interrogation, beating him so viciously that his skull, jaw, nose, cheekbones, and windpipe were crushed. We can only imagine the horror that Kiki felt when his captors produced a power drill, which they used to drill into his skull while he was still alive. How do we know he was still alive? The toxicology report showed the presence of amphetamines in Kiki's system, despite the fact that he never used the drugs himself. This implied to DEA investigators that Kiki was given the drugs so that he would remain awake and conscious during the torture. In more recent years, members of the Jalisco Nueva Generación Cartel, or CJNG, captured a member of a rival cartel, the aforementioned Los Chapitos, and decided to record his torture and murder. By the time the video started, the man's face was already beaten and bloody, and his arms were being tied behind his back on a chair. One of his torturers produced a chainsaw while another questioned him and began sawing into the man's legs. Eventually, when the torturers had done all they wanted to, they sawed off the man's legs entirely and poured water onto him. Then there are the horrific crimes of the Los Zetas, one of the best-known drug cartels outside of the Sinaloa cartel. The Zetas don't have the Sinaloa's numbers or name recognition, but they make up for it with their truly extraordinary acts of brutality. In one video, a woman in a pink shirt is forced onto her knees by a Los Zetas agent, who holds up a straight razor before saying, "Well, gentlemen, this is what happens to all those in the Gulf Cartel," on behalf of Los Zetas. The woman does not resist, seemingly drugged as the man holds the razor to her throat and slices off her head over the course of a brutal 40 seconds as her perforated throat wheezes air. When the slicing is complete and her body falls to the floor, the Zetas assassin holds up her severed head like a trophy. This particular video understandably garnered massive controversy when it was leaked on Facebook. Much like Los Chapitos, the Zetas even have their own murder, torture, and body disposal ranch, La Gallera Ranch in northern Veracruz. After taking it over in 2011, the Zetas have used it as a hub of mass cremation, incinerating their victims to avoid evidence of their crimes ever coming to light. These cremations were performed in the ranch's 12 kitchens, in a scene described by witnesses as something far worse than any horror movie could ever conjure up. Some victims were dissolved in bathtubs full of acid. Others were chopped up and fed to crocodiles. In more pedestrian but no less horrifying cases, the bodies of the kidnapped, tortured, and murdered were buried in mass graves around the property. Perhaps the most upsetting part is that the locals knew this was happening for years, and even reported it, but the corrupt local police were in the pocket of the Zetas, and nothing was done. Whenever Los Zetas and the kitchen mixes, something horrible is sure to happen, and this fact is true all the way to the top. Miguel Ángel Treviño Morales, one of the alleged leaders of the cartel group, had a particular form of torture and execution he enjoyed that's referred to as el guiso, or the stew. The victims would be forced into a 55-gallon metal drum alive, and a fire would then be set underneath them, slowly boiling them alive. The incident that truly put Los Zetas on the map was the infamous 2011 San Fernando massacre, where the Zetas kidnapped and murdered 193 people on La Joya Ranch. After hijacking a number of buses, the victims were dragged onto the ranch where the women were brutalized and killed, and the men were given weapons and forced to fight each other to the death. People who were willing to kill to save their own lives were then recruited as more ruthless hitmen for Los Zetas in what is perhaps the most horrific job application process in modern history. The most horrifying part is that this isn't even an isolated incident. Multiple cartels have used forcing people to kill others as a source of psychological torment. A video that leaked online in 2023 appeared to show the horrifying fate of 5 students lured onto a cartel compound, who were forced to kill each other on camera when they refused an offer to join the cartel. The video depicted one student decapitating another with a machete, as another had their head beaten in with a piece of rock. The cocky and in-your-face style of Los Zetas made them plenty of enemies. They hanged 2 members of the Gulf Cartel, and in one video filmed themselves disposing of the headless bodies of 49 migrant workers whom they murdered. The former was seen as particularly insulting by members of the Gulf Cartel because the Zetas had originally served as their security force before splintering off and forming their own group. In 2012, the Gulf Cartel struck back with some horrific violence of their own. They released a video of several captured members of the Zetas tied up and pleading for mercy as they're interrogated about their leaders. When the Gulf Cartel operatives tire of asking questions, they descend on the Zetas with machetes, brutally hacking off each of their heads without so much as a flicker of remorse. Cartel members live by the machete, or die by the machete. Filming their crimes, as you may have noticed, is pretty standard for cartels. In one particularly vile video filmed by a group of unknown cartel members, you can see them goofing off with a severed human face while surrounded by dead bodies. One of them puts the face on like a Halloween mask, while his cartel friends laugh and joke about it. You may be feeling a little queasy hearing about all this murder and mayhem, though it kind of makes us wonder why you clicked on a video called Mexican Cartel's Most Brutal Torture Methods. But at the very least, we've got a consolation. The cartel isn't running unopposed. Mexico's finest are on the case, the top cops who want to put cartels like the Sinaloas and the Zetas on notice. Like Luis Cardenas Palomino, a law enforcement official once voted Mexico's best police officer, and he won't rest until… Wait, he was working for the cartel too? And he was involved in torturing people? That's right. While we personally think that Palomino's Best Police Officer award should be revoked, he's in the runnings for its most criminal and corrupt. He was arrested for abusing suspects under his care, facilitating torture, and essentially being a glorified errand boy for El Chapo. His former boss, Genaro Garcia Luna, was also imprisoned for corruption and drug trafficking, so he's been doing a fine job holding up institutional traditions. Palomino has a shady past, having been implicated in a murder in his adolescence before proving himself to be a reliable asset for cartel bigwigs who wanted a friend on the inside of Mexican law enforcement. Because of crooked cops like Palomino, Mexican law enforcement and special forces have been accused of a bevy of horrific crimes, from taking bribes to committing straight-up massacres on the cartel's behalf. And of course, there's plenty of torture too. One of the favorite methods of people like Palomino is known locally as chicharra, which involves using a cattle prod to repeatedly shock the genitals of a prisoner in order to induce confessions, even if they know the person they're tormenting is innocent. They've also been known to repeatedly suffocate victims with plastic bags, employ Guantanamo-style waterboarding techniques, and beat victims within an inch of their life, sometimes accidentally killing them in the process. Dr. Robert Bunker, a research director at the security consulting firm CO Futures LLC, said of the torturous cartel cops, "Basic torture techniques can include the use of bladed instruments, pliers, and clippers, but fire, water, and electrical-based approaches can also be readily applied. But we can't lay the responsibility of all this torture at the feet of Palomino. It's far more systemic in nature than that." An anonymous Mexican police commander told the Daily Beast, "Torture is committed on a grand scale, and it will never disappear because our institutions lack the resources and capacity to prosecute someone for what is done through torture." This same anonymous commander, to his cartel-corrupted co-workers, employed psychological tortures as well as physical, like arresting the families of victims and threatening to kill or torture them in order to induce confessions. Former DEA Chief of International Operations Mike Vigil actually claimed that brutal torture methods have been a part of the Mexican law enforcement credo even outside of cartelian influence. He said all of Mexico's security forces have used torture since their very inception, and it has become normal for them. They look at it as an easy way to solve cases and don't understand that it's a violation of human rights or that anyone will confess when tortured. Of course, Mexican drug cartels don't have an absolute monopoly on disturbing cartel violence. After all, one of the most feared and infamous drug kingpins of all time, Pablo Escobar, was Colombian. However, one of the most popular factoids about how Escobar's Medellin cartel liked to torture people is actually an urban legend, the dreaded Colombian necktie. Now, we don't mean that it was a total myth like the Iron Maiden. It was very much practiced on people for a number of years. The torture involved slitting the victim's throat and yanking the tongue out of the wound so it rests against the upper chest like a bloody necktie. However, while it's commonly misattributed to Pablo and his gang, it was actually a feature of a brutal period of the Colombian Civil War, known as La Violencia, which went on for a decade between 1948 and 1958, predating the 1976 rise of the Medellin cartel by decades. For all our torture and mutilation fans out there, La Violencia was a goldmine of atrocities, from the Colombian necktie to the flower vase cut, where victims' limbs were cut off and stuffed into their body, to a torture where, much like the Mexican cartels, victims' genitals were cut off and shoved into their mouth, and perhaps most upsetting of all, cases where pregnant women had the fetuses cut out of their wombs and replaced with a rooster. The cruel irony of all the coverage of Mexican cartel brutality, including this video, is exactly what the cartel wants. The theatrical brutality of the cartel is a brutal but sophisticated PR move, advancing their image as feared and unstoppable gangsters who rule their respective territories. Very similar to the tactics employed by terrorist groups, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, with their own traumatic videos of horrific violence. But the acts of torture and murder are often so audacious, how could they not provoke some kind of reaction? But if this video has taught you anything, it's hopefully this. If you find yourself taking a vacation to Mexico anytime soon, and you happen to run into someone involved in a drug cartel, remember to be polite. If we make another one of these videos, we'd hate for any of our subscribers to appear in the sequel. Now check out El Chapo versus Pablo Escobar. How do they compare? Or watch this video instead.